Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of the samurai. The warriors, the shoguns, the castles, and the whole vanished world of old Japan. 7 centuries that rose from a rough band of provincial horsemen and disappeared in a single generation. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. But only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight, and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. Imagine a mountain pass in old Japan, on a winter night, watching a single warrior climb toward you through the falling snow. Picture it. The snow is coming down in great slow flakes, the kind that fall without wind, straight and unhurried, as if the sky had all the time in the world. And the pass is silent, the way only snow can make a place silent. The cedar forest on both slopes holding its whiteness without a creak, the road a pale ribbon under the darkness, and every sound in the world swallowed except 2. The first is a temple bell, somewhere far down the valley. One deep bronze note every little while, rolling up through the snowfall, softened by distance into something less like sound than like memory. And the second is the man. You hear him before you see him, the slow crunch of straw boots in fresh snow, the faint rhythmic creak of lacquered armor, plate whispering against silk cord with every step. And once, when he pauses, the small, clean ring of a sword-fitting, touching metal. A sound like a struck cup, gone as soon as it comes. Then he rises out of the dark of the road into the grey light of the snow, and you see him whole, the wide-brimmed helmet white-shouldered with snowfall, the face masked in black iron, the great curved bow taller than himself slung at his back, the 2 swords at his hip, the long and the short, the armour of 100 small scales laced in crimson silk, each plate carrying its little roof of snow. He stops at the height of the pass. He looks back down the way he has come, at the valley, at the far bell, at something the night does not show us. The snow settles on him as it settles on the cedars, without hurry, without weight. And then he walks on, over the pass and down into the dark on the other side, and the snow closes behind him, and the bell rolls up the valley once more, and the pass is empty again, as empty as if he had never come. As empty as the world he belonged to, which vanished, all of it, within a single lifetime. The swords, the castles, the whole 700-year order of it. And left behind only the snow, and the bell, and the story we are about to tell. He is a samurai, and tonight we will tell the entire story of his kind, from beginning to end. And it is one of the strangest and most beautiful stories in the history of the world. It is the story of how a class of rough provincial horsemen, hired to guard the estates of perfumed aristocrats, took a country away from its emperors and ruled it for 700 years. It is the story of the wars. The great clan war of the Genpei, where an empire's fate was decided in sea foam and a child emperor sank beneath the waves. The 2 typhoons that saved Japan from the greatest empire on earth and were named the winds of the gods. The century of chaos when the whole land burned, and the 3 extraordinary men who ended it. The brutal visionary, the peasant who conquered a country, and the patient one who waited and won everything. And it is, just as much, the story of the peace. The 250 years when the fiercest warrior class in the world was locked inside a closed country with no wars left to fight, and turned itself into something history had never seen. Swordsmen writing poetry, killers arranging flowers, an entire military caste slowly transforming into administrators, philosophers, and dreamers, polishing an ideal of the warrior's way that grew more perfect as the reality of war grew more distant. We will walk the castle towns and the pleasure quarters of that long peace. We will sit in the tea room, where a bowl of whisked green tea became a religion of stillness. We will meet the women who fought, the poets who wandered, the masters who taught the sword as a path to enlightenment. And then we will watch it all end, faster than anyone believed possible. The black ships in the bay, the old order cracking like spring ice, the top knots cut, the swords banned, the last great samurai dying on a green hill with an era. A warrior world 7 centuries deep, dismantled in a single generation and passing. This is the strangest part, and we will take our time with it. Almost directly from reality into legend, so that the samurai vanished and became immortal in nearly the same moment. So stand a last moment at the top of the pass where the warrior stood. The snow is still falling, straight and slow. The bell speaks again, far off. Down there, beneath the white roofs of the valley, is the world he came from. And to understand him, we cannot begin with him at all. We have to begin 1,000 years ago, in a city of silk and moonlight and poetry, among people who would have been horrified to learn that history would remember their age chiefly as the cradle of the men with swords, the exquisite, doomed, perfumed world of the Heian court, the world the samurai were born to guard and destined to replace. Before the story, the fires stand in question. How do we know? And with the samurai, the question has a special edge, because no warrior class in history has been so thickly wrapped in its own legend, and half the work of telling this story, honestly, is knowing which layer of the wrapping we are touching at any moment. Begin with the epics, because that is where the samurai themselves began their own story. The great source for the wars that made them is the tale of the Heike, the vast chronicle of the Genpei War, composed in the century after the events, and its transmission is one of the wonders of world literature. For hundreds of years it was not primarily read but sung, performed from memory by guilds of blind, itinerant monks, the Baiwa Hoshi, who travelled Japan with lute on back, chanting the fall of the Heike clan in temple courtyards and castle halls, shaping and polishing the tale through 10,000 performances the way the sea shapes a stone. Its opening lines are the most famous in Japanese literature. The tolling of the temple bell, the sermon that all is impermanence, that the mighty fall at last, dust before the wind. And every Japanese schoolchild can still recite them. As history, the Heike must be handled the way this fire handles all epics. It is built on real events, real names, real battles confirmed by court diaries and temple records, and it is literature arranging those facts into tragedy. We will use it tonight as the Japanese have always used it, as the truest voice of the age's meaning, checked against the drier documents for the age's facts. And the drier documents exist in abundance, because Japan is a country of extraordinary record-keeping. Court diaries kept by Heian aristocrats, day by day, for centuries, temple and shrine archives. The administrative records of the shogunates, land registers, law codes, judicial verdicts in lawsuits between warrior families, which show us the samurai not as legends but as litigants, arguing about inheritance and water rights like landowners anywhere on earth. From the warring centuries, the chronicles of the great clans, letters of the warlords themselves. We have Nobunaga's correspondence, Hideyoshi's letters, including startlingly tender ones to his wife and mother, Ieyasu's testament. The reports of the first Europeans, Jesuit missionaries who arrived in the gunpowder century and wrote home detailed, astonished accounts of Japanese warfare, castles, and manners, and the house codes. The written rules that samurai clans set down for their own members, which tell us what warriors actually worried about loyalty, yes, but also drinking, gambling, lawsuits, and the correct width of a retainer's sleeves. From the long Edo piece, an ocean of paper, census rolls, domain budgets, samurai household accounts complaining about debts, the diaries of low-ranking warriors recording lives of paperwork and boredom, and the popular literature and woodblock prints of the townsmen who watch the samurai with the mixture of awe, envy, and satire that common people have always directed at their betters. And then there is the problem, the one this fire will name now and keep beside it all night like a lamp, the legend. Much of what the modern world believes about the samurai, the timeless, unchanging code of Bushido, the warrior who serenely prefers death to dishonor in every circumstance, the mystic perfection of the katana, is not a simple description of how 7 centuries of real warriors lived. A great deal of it was written down late, in the Edo piece, by samurai who had never seen a battle, idealizing their grandfathers, some of its most famous texts. The Hagakure among them, dictated by a retainer forbidden to follow his lord in death, nostalgic and extreme, were obscure in their own day and made famous only in the 20th century, when modern Japan reached back and refashioned the samurai ideal for the age of nation-states, with consequences that belong to the end of our story. None of this makes the ideals false. Men genuinely died for loyalty, and the sword genuinely was the soul of its bearer to many who wore it. It makes them historical, things that grew, changed, and were argued over, like everything human. The fire's method tonight is therefore simple. We will let the samurai be real first and legendary second, landowners and litigants as well as heroes, frightened as well as fearless, and their vanished world will turn out to be, in the honest telling, stranger and more moving than the legend ever was. To understand why the samurai happened, you must first stand for an hour in the world that made them necessary. And it is one of the most refined, most peculiar, and most doomed societies that has ever existed. The imperial court of Heian-kyo, the city of peace and tranquility, the place we now call Kyoto. Picture it around the year 1000. Japan has an emperor, descended, so the chronicles taught, in unbroken line from the sun goddess herself, and around him, in a capital laid out on the Chinese grid, lives an aristocracy of perhaps a few thousand people who have refined the art of living to a point no society has reached before or since. Rank is everything, and rank is visible. The precise colours a courtier may wear, the height of his gait, the number of folds in a sleeve. Beauty is a moral category. A man is judged by his calligraphy. The belief being, quite seriously held, that the movement of the brush reveals the soul. A love affair begins with a poem and lives or dies by the quality of the paper, the ink, the chosen blossom attached, and the messenger's timing. Gentlemen weep openly at the moon, at falling cherry blossoms, at the sound of an autumn insect, and are admired for it. Sensitivity to the pathos of things, no aware, the beautiful sadness of a world where everything passes, is the highest accomplishment of the human heart. In this hothouse, the women of the court, writing in the vernacular while men wrote stiff Chinese, produced the age's immortality. Say Shogun's pillow book, a courtier lady's notebook of lists and opinions so alive it might have been written this morning, and Murasaki Shikibu's Tale of Genji. By common consent, the world's first novel, 1,000 pages of love, memory, and loss among the shining people of the court, written by a woman 1,000 years ago and never surpassed on its own ground. And this exquisite world had 3 fatal blindnesses. First, it despised the provinces. Everything beyond the capital was, to a Heian courtier, barbarism. A place of exile worse than death, populated by rustics. The actual governing of the countryside, the collecting of the rice that fed the silk world, was delegated, farmed out, pushed away. Second, it despised violence. The court aristocracy had, in its early centuries, quietly abolished its own army. Death pollution was ritually contagious. A gentleman did not carry arms. He hired them. And third, it could not stop giving away the tax base. Great families and great temples accumulated private estates. Shogun, exempt from imperial taxation, until the map of Japan became a patchwork of private lordships, and the throne itself grew poor in everything but prestige. Add the 3 together, and the consequence writes itself. Out in the despised provinces, on the private estates, far from the perfumed capital, somebody had to keep order, put down rebels, guard the harvests, and enforce the claims of absentee lords. Somebody armed, mounted, hard-handed, and local. The court called them, with faint disdain, samurai, those who serve, attendants, armed servants. The word would outlive the world that coined it. So the samurai were born not in a battle but in a vacuum. The space between a capital that would not govern and a countryside that had to be governed. And the fire will spend this hour watching the vacuum fill. The raw material was the provincial gentry, local strongmen, estate managers, minor branches of aristocratic families sent out to the provinces and gone native. and, crucially, two lineages of surplus princes. The imperial house, rich in sons and poor in offices, periodically pruned itself. Princes surplus to the succession were given surnames, Taira for some, Minamoto for others, and sent to the provinces to make their own way. They made it magnificently. Within a few generations, the Taira and the Minamoto were the great warrior networks of the land. Imperial blood, provincial muscle, chieftains around whom the local fighting men clustered, generation by generation, in bonds of service and reward that would become the skeleton of everything that followed. And the warrior these networks bred was, first and last, a horseman with a bow. Forget, for now, the sword saint of later legend. The early samurai's art was Kyuba no Michi, the way of horse and bow, and his battlefield was a moving one. Galloping archery, the rider controlling his horse with his knees while drawing a great asymmetric longbow, loosing at the gallop, wheeling away. A skill demanding a lifetime, which is precisely the point. It made the warrior a specialist, unreplicable by any peasant levy, as expensive and as decisive as a knight's charge in the Europe of the same centuries. Around the horseman grew the equipment that would define the class's look for ages, the o-yoroi, the great armor. A box-like harness of hundreds of small lacquered scales laced with silk cords in brilliant colors, light enough for the saddle, gorgeous by intention for a warrior expected to be seen and remembered. The helmet with its spreading neck guard, and, yes, the swords. But as sidearms still, the tools of the last resort, their great age not yet come. More important than any weapon was the shape of the bond. The warrior served a lord. In the early centuries, a chieftain of his own network, a Taira or Minamoto captain. And the service was personal, contractual in spirit if not on paper, loyalty and military service downward given, protection and reward upward owed, and the reward that mattered was land. Confirmation of one's holdings, or new ones carved from a defeated enemy. The Fire underlines this early, because the whole 7th-century story runs on it. Samurai loyalty, in the real world, was an exchange, and it was strongest when the exchange was honored. The ages of chaos ahead will show, again and again, retainers abandoning lords who could not reward them. And the later legend of absolute, unconditional loyalty will be, in large part, the peacetime perfection of an ideal precisely because the reality had been so negotiable. And one more feature of the early warrior world deserves its minute, the house. A samurai fought as part of an eye, a household, a lineage, whose name, honor, and lands were a single inheritance across generations. Battle was studded with the ritual of self-naming, warriors declaiming their ancestry before combat, because a deed unclaimed was a deed wasted. The house's glory was the currency in which everything else was banked. Through the 10th and 11th centuries, these warrior networks did the court's dirty work, suppressing pirates on the inland sea, crushing provincial revolts, fighting the court's frontier wars. And with every commission they grew, in lands, in followers, in self-confidence, provincial muscle slowly discovering that the perfumed capital could not, in fact, do anything without them. The discovery took 2 centuries to ripen. When it ripened, it did so in the middle of the capital itself, in a pair of bloody palace coups in the 1150s where, for the first time, the factions of the court called warriors into the streets of the city to settle a succession dispute. And the warriors, once inside the gates, looked around at the silk and the ceremony and understood, as one, that nothing in this city could stop them. The age of the courtiers had ended, though the courtiers would take another generation to notice. The question was no longer whether warriors would rule Japan, it was which warriors. And that question would be answered by the greatest war of the age, between the two great houses of imperial blood, the Taira and the Minamoto. Zen will enter the story in its season, but the warrior's religion did not begin there, and the fire pauses here, early, to lay in the deeper ground. The layered faith the samurai actually lived inside, which was older than their class and outlasted it. The oldest layer had no founder and needed no name until foreign faiths arrived and it acquired one, Shinto, the way of the kami, the spirits, the presences, the sacrednesses of the land itself. A kami might be the sun goddess ancestral to the throne, or a great mountain, or a waterfall, or a heroic dead man, or the small genius of one grove marked by nothing but a rope of rice straw around a tree. The tradition's genius was location, holiness as geography, the land itself divine, and studded with doors to it. The Torii Gate, 2 posts and 2 lintels, marking every threshold where the ordinary crossed into presence. For the warrior class, this oldest layer supplied the deepest things, purity and pollution as the grammar of ritual life, the clan shrine binding the house to its territory, and above all the ancestors, because a samurai house was religiously considered a lineage of the dead administered by the living. The memorial tablets on the household altar, the graves tended, the deeds of the forebears recited, the living heir a trustee reporting at the year's festivals to a constituency of ghosts. Every act of self-naming before battle in the Genpei chapters. I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, grandson of the governor of such, was, at bottom, liturgy. The house's dead invoked as witnesses and shareholders of the deed about to be done. Onto this ground, Buddhism had come from the continent a millennium before our story, and Japan's oldest religious genius was that it refused to choose. The kami were understood as local faces of the Buddhas. The shrines and temples grew up interleaved, often in the same precinct, served by the same families, and a warrior moved through both without any sense of contradiction. Praying to Hashiman, the war kami, the Minamoto took as patron, whose shrine Yoritomo raised at the heart of Kamakura, funding sutra copying for his father's rebirth. Wearing a guardian Buddha amulet under the armor, laced by a wife who had consulted the yin-yang diviners about the campaign's auspicious day. Death was where the layers did their heaviest work, and honesty pauses there. Whatever the later legend says of serene warrior indifference, the age's own documents are full of religious dread. Battle meant killing, killing meant karma, and the warrior's afterlife prospects were, by the doctrines he funded, poor. The Pure Land faiths swept the warrior class and the commons alike in the medieval centuries precisely because they answered that dread with radical mercy. Salvation not by merit, which a killer could not accumulate, but by simple trust in Amida's vow. The Nembutsu on the lips of the drowning Heike nobles at Dan-no-Yura, the promise of the Western paradise carried into every burning castle of the age. And later ages added their layers in turn. The Neo-Confucian ethics of the Edo peace, teaching the samurai-turned-clerk his duties as a social bond. The deified heroes. Ieyasu shining at Nikko, Hachiman's banners. The war dead enshrined as kami. The great grave mound faiths of loyalty this fire will meet again, transformed at the story's modern end. Hold the whole layered picture as the night proceeds. Sword and silence made the famous couple, but the warrior's actual inner world was this crowded, humane, anxious household of gods. Ancestors at the altar, the kami in the grove, Amida's mercy for the darkness, the diviner's calendar on the wall. Which is to say, a religion much like everyone's, assembled, inherited, argued with, and leaned on hardest at the doors. The war that made the samurai masters of Japan began, as such wars do, with a victor who rose too high. In the wake of the palace coups, the Taira chieftain Kiyomori emerged supreme. The first warrior in Japanese history to rule the state. He took the highest offices, married his daughter to the emperor, filled the government with Taira kinsmen, and at the summit of his fortune placed his own infant grandson, the child Antoku, on the imperial throne. The proverb the age coined tells you everything about the mood. If you are not a Taira, you are not a human being. And the tale of the Heike, which takes his clan's name, frames his rise with its famous bell. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The dream broke in 1180. A passed-over prince issued a call to arms against the Taira, and in the eastern provinces. The Kanto Plain, the deep country of warrior households far from the capital's perfume. The call was answered by the surviving heir of the crushed Minamoto, Yoritomo, a cold, patient, supremely political man who had spent 20 years in exile and wasted none of them. The war that followed, The Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, from the alternate readings of the two clans' names, is Japan's Iliad. 5 years of burning temples, famine years, reversals, and battles that every Japanese generation since has known by heart. The fire will walk its legend-crested moments as the blind singers shaped them, with the historian's lamp kept lit alongside. There is Yoritomo's cousin Yoshinaka, the rough mountain genius who took the capital first and lost it, and at whose last stand rides one of the most extraordinary figures of the age, Tomoe Gozen, a woman, his captain and companion, whom the Heike describes without embarrassment as a warrior worth 1,000, fair-skinned and long-haired, a peerless archer and swordswoman who, in her final battle, rode into an enemy band, dragged their strongest man from his horse, and took his head, before being ordered from the field by her dying lord, because he could not bear the shame of dying. Beside a woman, or, the tale allows us to suspect, could not bear her to die. She rides out of the story into legend, and the fire will return to her sisters later in the night. And there is the war's incomparable star, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's young half-brother, raised in a temple, small, brilliant, and utterly without fear. The greatest battlefield commander Japan had yet produced, and its most beloved tragic hero ever since. It was Yoshitsune who broke the Taira in 3 impossible strokes. At Ichinotani, leading a handful of riders down a cliff path behind the Taira camp that both armies had agreed no horse could descend. The chronicle has him watching deer pick their way down and remarking that where a deer goes, a horse goes. At Yashima, bluffing a fraction of his force into looking like an army by the light of farmhouse fires. And finally, in the spring of 1185, at Dan no Yura, the sea-straight battle that ended the world's most refined clan in salt water. The fire slows here, as the Heike slows, because Dan no Yura is one of the terrible, unforgettable scenes of world literature. The Taira, driven west across the inland sea for 2 years, staked everything on their fleet in the narrow strait where the tides run like rivers. The tide favoured them in the morning and turned against them at noon, and with it turned the battle and an age. As the Minamoto boats closed in, the Taira nobility chose the sea. The chronicle gives us the moment through the eyes of the drowning court. The child emperor Antoku, 6 years old, in his shipboard robes, asking his grandmother, the nun of second rank, where they were going, and her answer, that beneath the waves they would find another capital, a pure land where no sorrow comes. And she took the boy in her arms, with the sacred sword of the imperial regalia at her waist, and stepped into the strait. The sword was never recovered. The sea at Dan no Yura, fishermen said for centuries after, was haunted. The small crabs of those waters bear on their shells a pattern like a scowling warrior's face, and are called Heike crabs to this day. The drowned clan, the folk belief holds, still glaring up through the shallows at the world that ended them. The victor's epilogue was as Japanese as the tragedy. Yoshitsune, the war's flawless hero, was destroyed not by an enemy but by his brother. Yoritomo, reading the young man's fame and the court's affection for him as the threat they genuinely were, outlawed him, and after years as a fugitive. Years that folklore filled with disguises, loyal companions, and narrow escapes. Above all, his giant warrior monk retainer Benkei, who died on his feet at the last bridge, standing dead with arrows in him while his master made his end within. Yoshitsune was cornered and died by his own hand at 30. Japan never accepted it. The national heart adopted him permanently. There is a phrase in the language, Hogan Biki, sympathy for the lieutenant, meaning the love of the doomed underdog, coined for him and applied ever since to every gallant loser in Japanese life. And legends grew that he had escaped. North to the wild island, some said, and further, until in the wilder versions he crossed the sea and became, of all people, Genghis Khan, which is nonsense, and which tells you precisely how much the country could not bear to let him die. His cold brother, meanwhile, took the prize the whole war had been for. In 1192, Yoritomo received from the court the ancient title of Sei Taishogun, barbarian subduing great general, Shogun for short, and he did the genuinely revolutionary thing. He did not move to the capital. He ruled from his own eastern town of Kamakura through his own warrior government, the Bakufu, the tent government, leaving the emperor enthroned in Kyoto as the sacred, powerless source of legitimacy. The arrangement he invented, a reigning emperor and a ruling shogun, the throne as the jewel and the warrior as the hand, would define Japan for nearly 700 years. The attendants had become the masters, and they would remain the masters until the age of steamships. For its first century, the warrior government at Kamakura governed a closed world. And then, in 1268, a letter arrived from the mainland that changed the meaning of everything. It came from Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, master of the largest empire the human species had ever assembled, whose story this fire has told on another night. And beneath its diplomatic courtesies lay a single demand: submit, or be visited by armies. Every kingdom in Asia had faced that letter. Korea had submitted after decades of devastation. China's Song dynasty was in its death struggle. The court in Kyoto panicked and prayed. The warriors in Kamakura, with the plain rudeness of provincials who had never lost, did not answer at all, not to this letter, nor to the 5 that followed. And so, twice, the Mongol Empire came for Japan. And what happened is one of history's great hinge events, and the fire will tell it carefully, because the truth is even better than the famous legend. The first invasion came in 1274, a fleet from Korea carrying a Mongol Chinese-Korean army, seizing the outlying islands with a brutality the Japanese sources record in grief, then landing at Hakata Bay in Kyushu. The battle that followed was a collision of 2 military worlds. The samurai came on in their way, champions riding forward, declaiming lineage, seeking worthy single combat. The Mongols fought in theirs, massed, drilled, silent-signaled formations, poisoned arrows in dense volleys, and thunder crash bombs. Gunpowder shells hurled by catapult, bursting with fire and iron, the first gunpowder weapons Japanese warriors had ever faced. A scroll commissioned by a veteran shows one exploding beside his rearing horse, and his account survives because he spent years afterward petitioning for reward. The samurai were mauled and fell back at dusk toward the interior, and in the night the weather turned. And by morning the invasion fleet, exposed in the open bay, was withdrawing, storm-battered, for Korea. The first winds had spoken, though the age had not yet named them. Kamakura understood it had been given not victory but warning. What followed was 7 years of the most unglamorous samurai heroism on record: construction. Along the whole curve of Hakata Bay, the warrior government built a stone wall, 2 to 3 meters high, running for 20 kilometers, raised by conscripted labor and taxed rice. Its remains still standing in Fukuoka's suburbs today. Coastal watches were organized, small boat squadrons drilled, the warrior households of Kyushu bound to rosters of guard duty that survive in the archives, tedious and precise. And in 1281 the full storm came, the second invasion, and this time it was one of the largest seaborne expeditions in pre-modern history. 2 fleets, from Korea and from conquered South China, carrying an army counted in the tens of thousands upon thousands of ships. And the wall worked. For weeks the Mongol armada probed the bay and could not land in force. The stone held the beaches, samurai defended the line by day, and by night. This is the part the legend forgets and the fire loves. Small Japanese boats went out among the anchored fleet in the dark, boarding parties of swordsmen against ship crews, cutting, burning, and rowing away. The fiercest cavalry class in Asia, winning its greatest campaign as Marines. For 2 months, the greatest empire on earth hung off the coast of Japan, unable to get ashore. And then, in mid-August, the sky delivered the verdict. A typhoon, a real one, massive, recorded across the region, came up out of the Pacific and fell upon the crowded fleets in their anchorages, and when it passed, the invasion of Japan had ceased to exist. Ships by the 1,000 driven onto rocks and each other, an army drowned or stranded to be hunted on the beaches. Modern marine archaeology, raising wrecks from the mud of the bay, has confirmed both the scale and a contributing secret. Many of the South Chinese ships were hasty conversions and rivercraft, ill-built for ocean storm. Kublai planned a third invasion for years and never managed it. Japan remained, alone among the coveted lands of Asia, unconquered. The meaning-making began at once, and its echo would be long. The court and the temples, which had prayed furiously through both invasions, claimed the victory for heaven. The storms were named kamikaze, the divine winds, proof that the gods themselves defended the land of the gods. A doctrine of sacred invincibility entered the national soul, to sleep there for centuries and wake, terribly, in the 20th. When the name of the divine winds would be given to young men in aircraft, in a war this fire will not follow tonight. And there was a subtler consequence, closer to our story, that gnawed at the warrior world from within. Victory brought no lands. Every samurai war before had paid its winners from the losers' estates, but the Mongols left no estates behind. Only debts, 7 years of wall building, and thousands of warrior households that had bled and built and now petitioned Kamakura for rewards the regime simply did not possess. The temples claimed their prayers had won the war and demanded payment too. The ledger could not balance. The loyalty for reward exchange at the root of the whole samurai order had been honored by one side only, and the resentment of the unpaid, quiet, compounding, generational, became the crack along which, 50 years later, the Kamakura government itself would break. Japan's greatest victory was the beginning of its victor's fall. The fire has seen the pattern before, and never more cleanly than here. The fire has passed the word several times tonight, and will pass it again before dawn, and it will not leave it unexamined, because nothing about the samurai is more famous, more misunderstood, or more demanding of honest, careful telling than seppuku, the ritual of self-destruction. The fire will speak of it plainly, briefly, and without relish, as the subject deserves, and listeners for whom the theme sits heavily should know it occupies these few minutes only, and gently. Understand first what it was for, in the samurai's own logic, because it was never, in their understanding, mere suicide, which Buddhism in any case discouraged. It was a legal and moral instrument with distinct uses the age kept clearly separate. The defeated warrior's final act of agency, denying the enemy his person, his surrender, and his display, the door out of the burning castle that no besieger could lock, the protest of the retainer whose loyalty could find no other voice, like Nobunaga's old counselor, dying to shock his young fool of a lord awake, which worked, the atonement that cleared a house's name and, crucially, could preserve its lands and heirs when execution would attaint them. And the piece's great codification, the privileged punishment, the samurai condemned not to the executioner but to his own hand, the sentence that was simultaneously death and honor, which is precisely what the 47 received and why the verdict satisfied the age as it did. The choice of the belly was the age's anatomy of sincerity. The hara was where truth lived, the seat of intention, as the language still testifies in a dozen idioms. And to open it was the ultimate demonstration that nothing false was hidden. The act's terrible difficulty was its meaning. And then, understand what it actually became, because the Edo piece ritualized it as it ritualized everything. The classical form of the later age was ceremony throughout. The white robes and the writing of the death poem. A last verse, composed with care, and the genre contains some of Japan's most piercing lines. The tray, the wrapped short blade, and, always, the kaishakunin. The second, a trusted swordsman, often a friend, standing behind, whose stroke fell at the first cut, or, in the fully ritualized late form, at the mere reach for the blade. The beheading, precisely timed, being the mercy that made the ceremony humanly performable at all, and the second's role being counted among the heaviest duties one samurai could ask of another. The fire adds the two honest margins. First, junshi, following one's lord in death, grew common enough in the early Tokugawa decades that the shogunate banned it outright as a waste of retainers, and the ban held. The Hagakura's author, forbidden to follow his own lord, lived on to dictate his nostalgic extremities to a scribe. The book itself, in other words, is the voice of the door closing. And second, the practice was always rarer, more contested, and more legally hedged than the legend suggests. An extremity the culture built a frame around exactly because it was extreme. Most samurai, like most humans, died in bed. What remains, when the sensationalism is skimmed away, is the thing the fire finds genuinely worth carrying out of this room. A warrior culture that denied control over whether it died, constructed, at terrible cost. A form for controlling how. And that asked, at the last threshold, for a poem. The poems are the part to keep. Like the dew I vanish, wrote one departing lord, like the dew. And all of it, castles and quarrels and the sentence itself, a dream within a dream. Something else arrived from the mainland in these same centuries, on the same ships that carried the trade and the threats. And it fitted the warrior class so perfectly that within 3 generations no one could imagine them apart. Zen. Buddhism was old in Japan, but Zen, the meditation school carried from Song China by returning Japanese monks and by Chinese masters fleeing the Mongol conquest, was something new in flavour, a way that distrusted scripture and ceremony alike and put everything on direct experience. Long, silent sitting. The master's abrupt questions designed to break thought's habits. The insistence that awakening is not elsewhere and later, but here, in this breath, this act, this instant. And the warriors of Kamakura, rough new masters of a country whose old religious establishment despised them as blood-stained parvenus, met this austere import and recognized it instantly as theirs. The affinity ran deep and practical. A samurai's profession posed one problem above all others: death, sudden and near. And Zen's training was, among much else, a technology for facing exactly that, the cultivation of a mind that does not flinch, does not cling, does not divide itself in the crisis. The state the masters called mushin, no mind, in which the practiced act flows without the stutter of deliberation. A swordsman whose mind stops on anything. Fear, hope, the opponent's blade, is dead, the later sword masters would teach. Zen was the discipline of the unstopping mind. The great Kamakura regents took Chinese masters as their teachers. Monasteries rose in the warrior capital on the mainland model. And there began the long marriage. Sitting practice in the warrior's daily round, the meditation hall beside the archery ground. That would shape everything the world now recognizes as classically Japanese. Because the marriage bred far beyond the battlefield. Zen's aesthetic, austere, asymmetric, suggestive rather than complete, finding the whole moon in a broken reflection, flowed into the arts the warrior class patronized and practiced, and made them, the inkwash painting where 3 strokes and emptiness make a mountain in mist, the dry gardens of raked gravel and stone. The most famous, 15 stones in white gravel at a Kyoto temple, composed so that from any seat one stone is always hidden. Landscapes for the mind to walk when the body cannot. The spare poetry that would flower into haiku. The no theatre's masked stillness, where a single slow gesture carries a ghost's whole grief. And, supremely, the way of tea, whose small dark room will receive this fire's full attention deep in the peaceful centuries ahead. The fire flags, as honesty requires, that the neat equation of Zen and the samurai has been over-polished by modern popularizers. Plenty of warriors held to the older Buddhist schools above all the pure land faiths that promised salvation through simple trust, a comfort the Heike's drowning nobles reached for at Dan-no-Yura. And Zen monasteries were as worldly and political as any institution of their size. But the deep imprint is real, and it set the samurai on the strangest of their historical paths. Alone among the world's great warrior castes, they yoked the profession of violence to a discipline of stillness. And the tension between those two, sword and silence, never resolved and never abandoned, is the very thing that makes their vanished world inexhaustible to the imagination. Hold that tension through the night ahead. It is about to be tested by 2 centuries of the worst chaos Japan ever knew. The Portuguese castaways of 1543 brought the gun, and the fire pauses here, between the chaos and the unifiers, on everything else that came ashore with it. Because Japan's first European century is a story of its own, strange and consequential, and its ending shaped the sealed world of the peace. The traders came first and were welcome. The great black carracks from Macau, riding the monsoon into Kyushu harbors with Chinese silk, the Ming, embargoing Japan directly, had made the Portuguese the indispensable middlemen of the China trade. Europeans prospering with historical neatness as Silk Road brokers at the road's far ocean end. The Kyushu lords competed to host the ship, and one gave Nagasaki itself. A fishing village made a port, and the port made, for a time, actual Jesuit territory. For with the traders came the padres, Francis Xavier himself in 1549, and after him a mission that grew, within 2 generations, into one of the great surprises of the age. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese Christians, whole domains converting with their lord's conversion and the carrack's trade being, all parties understood, entangled, seminaries printing devotional books on a press carried from Europe, and Kyushu boys in doublets kneeling before the Pope in Rome as the age's most exotic embassy. The missionaries' letters home, trained observers, often generous, often appalled, always detailed, are among our best windows on Sengoku Japan, and the Japanese observed back with equal fascination. The age's painted screens of the southern barbarians survive by the dozen. The vast black ship at anchor, the captains in their absurd ballooning trousers, the tall hats, the African sailors, the padres in black, the goods parading ashore. Japan painting its own first contact, curious, amused, precise. The turn came with unification, and the fire has told its stations. Hideyoshi's edict and the 26 crosses of Nagasaki. The Tokugawa bands hardening decade by decade as the regime watched Spanish and Portuguese empire building elsewhere and drew the obvious conclusion about missionaries as vanguards. And the end at Shimabara, the desperate Christian peasant rising of 1637 whose crushing sealed the country. What the ban could not do, the fire records as the century's astonishing coda, was end the faith. The Kakure Kirishitan, the hidden Christians, went under entirely, without priests, without books, for 250 years. Baptisms whispered from parent to child, prayers drifted into chant formulas half remembered, the Virgin worshipped in the porcelain form of the Buddhist goddess of mercy, a statue with a hidden cross, whole villages keeping the secret through the era of the Fumii, the annual test in which suspected believers were made to tread on a bronze image of Christ. The polished, foot-worn plaques survive and are among the most unsettling objects in any Japanese museum. And in 1865, with the ports newly opened, a group of villagers approached a French priest at the new Nagasaki church and asked him, cautiously, 3 questions. About the Virgin, about celibacy, about Rome, and then told him, "Our hearts are the same as yours." 2.5 centuries in the dark, and the flame handed over intact, whatever else the sealed world was. And tonight has weighed it. It was never quite sealed from within. The peace kept its secrets, and some of the secrets kept themselves. And here the fire does what the mountain travellers did. It stops at the first shelter and lets the snow have its hour. The story has climbed hard. A court, a war, a drowned emperor, 2 typhoons. And before it enters the burning centuries, let it rest. Come back to the winter night where we began, but closer in now, inside the walls. It is a small mountain castle, late on the same snowing night. The keep stands dark above the courtyard. The garrison sleeps, and the snow comes down on it all with that same straight, unhurried patience. Settling on the curved roof tiles rank by rank, rounding the stone wall's shoulders, filling the courtyard's footprints one by one until the day's comings and goings are smoothed back into whiteness, as if the castle were being gently erased and redrawn simpler. One brazier glows in the gatehouse, where the night guard sits wrapped to the chin, his spear leaned in the corner, his hands around a bowl of hot water. He is not watching for anything. Nothing moves in the mountains on such a night, and he knows it. And the knowledge is itself a kind of warmth. The only sounds are the ones snow permits, the tick of the brazier's charcoal. The occasional soft collapse as a pine bough lets down its load somewhere in the dark, a white sound, instantly absorbed, and, still, at long intervals, that temple bell from down the valley. fainter from inside the walls, arriving now like something remembered rather than heard. In the keep's upper room, a single lamp burns behind paper. Someone is awake there, a steward finishing the granary ledger, or the lord's old mother at her sutras, or a boy who cannot sleep for tomorrow's first archery lesson. The paper window gives away nothing but the light itself, a soft amber rectangle floating above the white courtyard, the one human star in the whole smothered valley. The guard glances up at it once, without thought, the way one checks that the moon is still there. The mountains stand around the castle in the dark, wearing the snow. The castle stands in the mountains, wearing it too. And for this 1 hour there is no difference between them. Stone and slope, wall and forest, all of it simply holding still together under the same slow white patience, letting the night do the only work the night has, covering, quieting, keeping. Rest here as long as you like. The brazier is deep, the bell is patient, and the burning years can wait on the other side of the snow. When the story rises again, it will rise with a crack. The sound of an age breaking. But that is for later. For now there is only the falling white, and the amber window, and the guard's slow breath clouding and fading in the lamplit dark of the gate. The peace of the warrior governments was never deep, and in the 15th century it failed altogether. Not at a stroke, but like a floor giving way board by board, until all Japan stood on nothing. The Kamakura regime had already fallen in the 1330s, broken along the crack the Mongol Wars had opened. Brought down by an emperor who briefly dreamed of ruling as well as reigning, and by the great warrior houses that used him and then discarded his dream. From the wreckage rose a second shogunate, the Ashikaga, ruling from the Muromachi district of Kyoto itself. It was a government of magnificent culture and dissolving authority. Under its patronage, the Zen arts reached their summit. The golden pavilion mirrored in its pond, the no theatre perfected, the tea ceremony taking form. While in the provinces, its appointed governors quietly became hereditary princes, and its control thinned decade by decade like ice in a warming lake. The ice broke in 1467. A succession dispute inside the shogun's own house drew the great lord's armies into Kyoto itself, and the Onin War burned the capital for 10 years. The city of Genji reduced to ash fields and weeds, the shogunate's prestige with it. And when the armies finally exhausted themselves, they had settled nothing except the single great truth of the new age. Power now belonged to whoever could take and hold it, and to no one else. Japan slid into the Sengoku Jidai, the age of the country at war, a century and a half in which the islands dissolved into dozens of warring domains, and the old order's every certainty went into the furnace. The age's emblem was a phrase the Japanese coined for it, Gekokujo, the low overthrow the high. Retainers deposed their lords and took their lands. Branch families devoured main families. Village leagues armed themselves and ruled valleys without any lord at all. One of the age's mightiest warlords began as a foot soldier. Another's house had been oil merchants. The old Shugo governors mostly perished in the churn. In their places rose a new breed. The Sengoku daimyo, warlords pure and simple, whose title to their domains was the sword, and who, precisely because they held by force alone, governed with a ferocious practicality the old regimes never matched, surveying every field, publishing their own law codes, building irrigation, courting merchants, mining silver. Each domain a small experimental state, forged and tested in permanent war. Warfare itself transformed under the pressure. The horse and bow champion of the Genpei gave way to something colder and larger, massed infantry. The Ishigaru, light feet, commoner foot soldiers raised by the tens of thousands, armed with pike and, soon, with the age's great disruptor. Battles grew from clan skirmishes into grinding campaigns of maneuver, siege, and logistics. Castles multiplied on every defensible hill until the land bristled. And in 1543, a Chinese junk with 3 Portuguese aboard wrecked on the little island of Tanegashima, and the local lord, examining the stranger's possessions, paid a fortune for 2 arquebuses and set his swordsmith to copying them. Within a generation, Japanese workshops were producing matchlock guns in quantities that astonished the Europeans who had introduced them. Within 2, the largest battles in the world were being fought in Japan, and the age of the mounted champion was over, in fact. Whatever the legend would later prefer to remember, into this furnace of guns, ambition, and dissolved certainties there now stepped, in sequence, the 3 most consequential men in Japanese history. The trio every Japanese schoolchild learns in a proverb about a cuckoo that will not sing. Nobunaga says, "Kill it." Hideyoshi says, "Make it want to sing." Ieyasu says, "Wait." The fire turns to them now. The Sengoku bristled the land with fortresses, and the Tokugawa peace froze the finest of them in place. And the fire owes an hour to the Japanese castle, because it is one of the world's great fortification traditions and one of its most beautiful. And because, like everything else tonight, it is a text about the class that built it. The early castles were the mountains themselves, Yamajiro, hill forts, ridgelines carved into terraced compounds, dry moats hacked across spurs, palisades and towers of timber. Thousands of them, most now just contour lines under forest that hikers walk without knowing. The revolution came with the gun and the great unifiers. Warfare's new scale pulled the castles down from the peaks to the plains and river junctions where armies and commerce moved, and the new age built to awe as much as to hold. The base first, the great stone ramparts, and they are an art in themselves. Colossal walls raised without mortar, the stones fitted and locked, rising in the distinctive concave sweep called the fan slope, bellying out at the base, curving to near vertical at the lip. A geometry that shed earthquakes the walls flex and settle, where rigid work would burst, defeated climbers, and turned the wall's own weight into its strength. The corner lines of the best work, Osaka's or Kumamoto's cyclopean blocks, are as satisfying as anything in stone anywhere. On the ramparts, the White Keep, the Tenshu, the tower, timber-framed, plastered white against fire arrows, roofs stacked in diminishing tiers with their gables curved like wings, gilded dolphin fish guarding the ridge ends against fire. Part watchtower, part treasury, part pure declaration. Azuchi's gold-leafed 7 stories began the language, and Himeji perfected it. The White Heron, a main keep, and 3 lesser towers linked on their hill above the plain, so poised in its whiteness that the martial purpose reads, at first sight, as grace. It was not grace only. The approach to any great keep is a killing maze. Gates opening into walled courts overlooked on all sides, paths doubling back under loopholes, rectangles for arrows, circles and triangles for guns, stone-dropping chutes jutting over the angles. Himeji's path to the keep, walked today by tourists in 20 minutes, passes through a dozen gates, each of which was a battle. And around the castle grew the age's true legacy, the town. Hideyoshi's separation edict had pulled the samurai off the land. The castle town, Jokomachi, is where they went. The moated core, the samurai quarters graded outward by rank, the temple districts cited as strong points on the approaches, the merchant and craftsman streets along the highways, plotted by trade. And the whole deliberately planned, in the great examples, as an economic engine. Markets freed, guilds curted, the daimyo's revenue as much commercial as agrarian. Sit with the list of them. Edo itself, a fishing village, made the largest city on earth around the shogun's castle. Osaka, Kanazawa, Nagoya, Hiroshima, Sendai, Kumamoto. The map of urban Japan today is, to a startling degree, the map of the castle towns. The modern country's cities stand where the Sengoku's paranoia and the Tokugawa's order put them. And the keeps themselves. The fire completes the story honestly. Of the hundreds that crowned the peace, 12 original towers survive. The rest fell not mainly to war, but to the Meiji government's auctions and demolitions. Castles were the old order in stone, and were sold for their timber to the bombs of 1945 and to fire. And were then, in the 20th century's great wave of civic longing, rebuilt in concrete by the dozens. The silhouettes restored to the skylines because the towns discovered they could not recognize themselves without them. A fortress class, abolished, its fortresses resurrected by the descendants of the townsmen it taxed. because the White Tower on the hill had stopped meaning power and come to mean home. The first of the three was the storm itself. Oda Nobunaga inherited, at 19, a minor domain in the provinces east of the capital, and a reputation so bad that his own retainers despaired. He dressed like a vagabond, rough-housed with peasant boys, and behaved at his father's funeral with a contempt that scandalized the province. One senior retainer committed suicide in protest, hoping by death to shock the young fool into seriousness. The fool, it emerged, was something else entirely. A mind of pure, cold originality wearing eccentricity as camouflage. And in 1560, all Japan learned it at once. A neighboring great lord marched on Nobunaga's domain with an army perhaps 10 times his strength, pausing en route to view heads and hold a victory banquet in a narrow gorge called Okihazama. Nobunaga, against his council's unanimous advice, led his few thousand out in a rainstorm, fell on the celebrating host through the downpour, and killed the great lord in his own camp before most of his army knew it was attacked. The victory made him famous. What he did with fame made him terrifying. For Nobunaga proceeded, over the next 2 decades, to break every power in central Japan with a method the age had never seen. Total in ambition, modern in means, and unsentimental to the edge of horror. He saw earlier than anyone what the gun truly meant. Not a novelty for skirmishers, but the death of the old army. And at Nagashino in 1575, he staged the demonstration, entrenching thousands of matchlock men behind anti-cavalry palisades and destroying, in volleys, the most feared mounted samurai corps in Japan as it charged home again and again into the smoke. He saw what money meant. He abolished the toll barriers and monopoly guilds that strangled trade, made his castle towns free markets, and funded war from commerce while rivals squeezed riceland. He saw what symbols meant. He enthroned and then discarded a puppet shogun, ending the Ashikaga line with a shrug. And he built, on a mountain above the lake road to Kyoto, the great castle of Azuchi. Not a fortress merely, but an argument. 7 soaring stories, gold-leafed and painted by the finest masters, visible for miles, the first of the great tower keeps, and a declaration in architecture that a new power had come whose like Japan had not seen. And he saw. This is the darkness in him, and the fire does not look away. What terror meant. The great Buddhist establishments of the age were armed powers, warrior monk armies, fortified temple towns, leagues of militant believers who defied warlords and broke sieges. Nobunaga judged them enemies like any other, and worse for claiming heaven's immunity. And at Mount Hiei in 1571, the ancient holy mountain above Kyoto, he burned the whole vast monastery complex and killed its population, monks and refugees together, by the thousand. His decade-long war against the fortress cathedral of the True Pure Land League at Osaka was the bitterest of the age. Japan gave him the nickname he seems to have relished, the Demon King, and he stamped his letters with a seal reading Tenkafubu, the realm under the sword. By 1582, the realm nearly was. Then, in the deep night of the 21st of June, one of his own senior generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, able, cultured, and for motives argued about ever since, turned his army in mid-March and surrounded the Kyoto temple, where Nobunaga was lodging almost unguarded. Woken by gunfire, Nobunaga understood at once. The sources give him a single sentence. There is no choice. Before he fought in the corridors, withdrew wounded to an inner room, and died in the fire that consumed the temple at 48, with the unification he had all but completed still unsealed. His body was never found. Mitsuhide's triumph lasted 11 days. History remembers him with a proverbial sneer as the 11-day shogun, because the Demon King's ablest general, hearing the news on a distant siege line, made peace with his opponent in secret, force-marched his army back across the country at a pace no one believed possible, and destroyed the betrayer at Yamazaki before the other lords had finished deliberating. That general is the second of the three, and his story is the most improbable in the history of the samurai, because he was not born a samurai at all. He was born a peasant's son in the same province as Nobunaga, with nothing. No lineage, no land, not even a surname. Small, wiry, and irresistibly quick, he attached himself to Nobunaga's service as a sandal-bearer. The lord nicknamed him Saru, Monkey, and discovered, assignment by assignment, that the monkey could do anything. Provision an army, charm an enemy into surrender, build a fort on a hostile river in a single night, so the legend runs, and the legend is at least honest about what he was for. He rose through Nobunaga's meritocracy of results as no commoner had ever risen, to general, to castle holder. And then, with his master's ashes barely cold and his master's betrayer 11 days dead at his own hands, Toyotomi Hideyoshi reached for the whole prize, and took it, in 8 years, less by battle than by an unmatched genius for making resistance feel like a worse bargain than submission. Rivals were outmaneuvered, isolated, besieged with overwhelming theatre. At one siege, he built a spiked castle overnight opposite the enemy's walls. At another, he drowned a fortress behind a purpose-built dike and lake. And then, at the point of the sword, offered terms so generous that surrender became irresistible, confirmed lands, honoured places in the new order. The last independent lords of West and East and the warrior monk leagues all came in. By 1590, for the first time in 150 years, Japan had one master, and he had begun life carrying another man's sandals. What he did with mastery shaped Japan for 3 centuries, and the fire marks the irony at the heart of it. The greatest social climber in the nation's history slammed the ladder up behind him. His great land survey measured every field in the realm to standard units, the foundation of all revenue and all lordship thereafter. His sword hunt of 1588 disarmed the countryside, collecting the weapons of peasants and villages to be melted, the edict said piously, into nails and clamps for a great Buddha. And his status edicts froze the classes in place. Samurai to their lord's service, farmers to their fields, no movement between. The fluid, ladder-climbing chaos of Gikokujo, the very world that had made a sandal-bearer master of Japan, was legislated out of existence by its own greatest beneficiary, the separation of warrior and farmer. Samurai off the land and into castle towns, living on stipends, peasants disarmed and taxed, created the caste order the Edo age would inherit and the world would mistake for timeless Japan. He ruled as regent, gaudy and brilliant. The Golden Tea Room, the vast Osaka castle, the entertainments where he played host to emperors. And the fire keeps its two-sided ledger even here. The same man banned and then bloodily persecuted the missionaries' faith when he judged it a foreign lever, crucifying 26 Christians at Nagasaki in 1597. And in his last years, reaching past Japan itself, he launched the wars this fire will not romanticize. 2 massive invasions of Korea, intended as stepping stones to the conquest of Ming China. Campaigns of initial lightning success, grinding stalemate against Korean resistance, Chinese armies, and the sea, where the Korean admiral Yi Sun-sin and his armoured turtle ships strangled the supply lines in a series of naval masterpieces, and of atrocities on the peninsula whose memory poisons the region to this day. The invasions consumed lives by the 100,000 and achieved nothing. They were still sputtering when Hideyoshi sickened and died in 1598, leaving the realm he had unified to a 5-year-old son, a council of regents sworn on their honour to protect the boy. And, watching them all with 40 years of patience banked, the 3rd man of the proverb, the one who had waited. The 3 unifiers own the Sengoku's ending, but the age itself belonged to a whole generation of extraordinary warlords, and the fire gives an hour to the greatest of the others, because the era's texture lives in them, and because several will matter again at Sekigahara and after. Begin with the perfect rivals, the pair the age itself mythologized. Takeda Shingen, the tiger of Kai, and Uesugi Kenshin, the dragon of Echigo. Masters of the mountain provinces north of the capital road, who fought each other 5 times on the same plain at Kawanakajima across a decade in a rivalry so evenly matched and so strangely chivalrous that it became the national image of worthy enmity. The 4th battle, bloodiest of the 5, produced the age's most painted scene. Kenshin, the story insists, breaking through to Shingen's own command post and slashing down at him from the saddle, the tiger parrying with his iron war fan, and when landlocked Kai was cut off from salt by a rival's embargo, Kenshin, the enemy, sent salt through the mountains with the message that he warred with armies, not with salt, the proverb sending salt to one's enemy lives in the language still. Shingen's cavalry and his governance, his flood-controlled dikes still function. His law code still quoted made him the man the demon king feared most. Nobunaga's letters go visibly careful when the tiger stirs. His banner bore the 4 characters the age knew by heart: wind, forest, fire, mountain. Swift as wind, silent as forest, fierce as fire, immovable as mountain. And his death of illness on the march toward the capital in 1573, kept secret 3 years by his own order while a double wore his face, may have changed history as much as any battle. The one army Nobunaga might not have stopped, stopping itself. Kenshin, war god devotee, probably celibate, possibly a serious scholarly minority, has long argued it a woman, a question the Fire reports as the genuinely open puzzle it is. Followed him to an anticlimactic death in his own privy fortress in 1578, and with the 2 mountain titans gone, the road to the centre lay open for the men our story has already crowned. Then the survivors and the characters. Date Masamune, the one-eyed dragon of the north. Childhood smallpox took the eye. Legend has him tearing it out himself. Who came of age just too late for the great game, submitted to Hideyoshi with theatrical nerve, arriving to a summons dressed for execution in white, throve under the Tokugawa, built Sendai, and, in the endgame's strangest gesture, launched his own ship. European-built on his own domain's slipway, carrying his own embassy across the Pacific and onto Rome, itself in 1613, samurai retainers calling on the Pope while the country closed behind them. His crescent moon helmet remains the age's most famous silhouette. Sanada Yukimura, the age's beloved doomed lancer, whose red-armoured defence of Osaka's south wall in the last campaigns. His 10-fold outnumbered sortie reaching, the accounts insist, within sight of Ieyasu's own standard before it broke. Earned him the epitaph Japan still quotes, the greatest warrior in the land, awarded him by his enemies. Kuroda Kanbei, the crippled strategist who took Hideyoshi's surrenders for him and whom Hideyoshi asked who might steal the realm, named. To the room's laughter and Kanbei's careful, immediate retirement. And the age's edge ran through households the fire has already honoured. Ai Naotora ruling as female lord, Tachibana Ginchio's kneeling retainers, the armoured remains in the battlefield digs. Hold this gallery as the background of everything the unifiers did. The Sengoku was not 3 great men and extras. It was a whole generation of formidable, cultured, ruthless, strange individuals, governing and killing and writing poetry across a broken country. The 3 who ended it were merely the ones the wheel left standing, and they knew it. Ieyasu kept Shingen's portrait, studied his methods, and adopted his governance wholesale. The machine of the Great Peace was built, in no small part, from the salvaged engineering of the magnificent losers. Tokugawa Ieyasu had spent his whole life being underestimated at exactly the right moments. A minor lord's son, he passed his childhood as a hostage, traded between greater powers as a living guarantee, watching, from the age of 6, how power actually moved. He survived alliance with Nobunaga's rise, a hard school. At one point, to satisfy his terrifying ally's suspicions, he was compelled to order the deaths of his own first wife and eldest son, a wound the sources let us see him carry silently for 40 years. He survived Hideyoshi's supremacy by bending precisely as far as necessary and no further, accepting in exchange for submission a transfer to the wild eastern provinces around a fishing village called Edo, which looked like exile and which he, with 2 decades of patient development, turned into the richest power base in Japan. He was not the genius of the 3. Nobunaga saw further. Hideyoshi moved faster. He was the most durable, a master of logistics, land, and time, who never risked what he could not afford and never forgot anything. When Hideyoshi died, leaving a child heir and a council of watchful rivals, everyone in Japan knew the peace was a held breath. Ieyasu, senior regent, richest lord, simply began, slowly, correctly, deniably, to gather the future. Marriages here, land grants there, until the loyalist faction, centered on the brilliant administrator Ishida Mitsunari, forced the question, and in the autumn of 1600 the two halves of Japan marched. They met on the 21st of October in rain and pre-dawn fog at a crossroads valley in the mountains whose name means barrier field, Sekigahara. It was the largest battle in samurai history, perhaps 160 or 70,000 men in the valley. And the fire will tell it as it happened, because the truth of Sekigahara is the truth of the whole age in one morning. It was decided less by swords than by promises. On paper, the Western army held the stronger ground, the mountain flanks, the numbers. But Ieyasu had spent the preceding months writing letters, dozens survive, into the Western command itself, and when the fog lifted and the lines ground together in the mud, the hinge of the day stood on a hill on the western flank. The young Lord Kobayakawa Hideaki, 15,000 men, sworn to Mitsunari, promised to Ieyasu, and frozen. Hour after hour, ignoring signals from both sides, while below him the battle hung even. Around noon, the famous story says Ieyasu, in fury, ordered a volley fired at the hill to force the boy's choice. Historians debate the volley, not the pressure. Kobayakawa moved, downhill, into the flank of his own side. The western line, betrayed at its pivot, and then deserted by other hedging contingents in a cascade, collapsed by mid-afternoon. Mitsunari was hunted down and executed in Kyoto. The great western lords were broken, exiled to distant islands, or stripped. And Ieyasu spent the next 3 years redrawing the entire map of Japan, confiscating and reassigning domains on a scale no ruler had ever attempted, planting his allies across the strategic heart of the country, and pushing the defeated to the edges, an arrangement whose long memory would matter 2.5 centuries later when the edges came back for the center. In 1603, the emperor named him Shogun, the title Hideyoshi's birth had barred him from, and he did the most characteristic thing of his life. After only 2 years, he resigned it to his adult son, ensuring the succession while he still lived to guard it, and ruled on from retirement. One task remained. Hideyoshi's son, Hideyori, grown to manhood in the vast fortress of Osaka, was a banner around which every masterless man and old loyalist in Japan might one day rally, and in 2 winter and summer campaigns in 1614 and 1615. The last great samurai battles of the age, filled with doomed valor on the walls. Ieyasu extinguished the Toyotomi house entirely. He died in bed the following year, 73 years old, master of everything, and was enshrined, literally, deified as the great Gongan, light of the east, in the mountain mausoleum of Nikko, where the lanterns of the lords he had beaten burn for him still. The cuckoo had sung at last, and the silence that followed its song. The fire means this precisely, lasted 250 years. The fire promised the piece's pageantry, and here is its grandest recurring spectacle. The thing the whole road system existed to carry, a daimyo's alternate attendance procession, and the fire will walk one east along the great coastal highway, the Tokaido, in the year 1730, because half of what the age built makes sense only from the roadside as it passes. It leaves the castle town at dawn with gunfire, the signal pieces, and it is a moving state. For a great domain, 1,000 retainers and more, marshalled in an order fixed by protocol and published in advance like a playbill. First the runners, clearing the way with the famous cry, "Shita ni airo, down, be down," at which commoners along the route kneel at the verge, the fire notes. Honestly, that enforcement varied with the domain's dignity and the district's patience. Edo townsmen were notorious for economical, minimal crouching. Then the vanguard spearmen, the led horses in lacquered tack, the chests of armour slung on poles. The class's soul, travelling as luggage, the palanquins of the senior officials, the massed ranks with pike and matchlock, every man in the domain's livery, and at the heart, the lord's own palanquin, lacquered, crested, borne by relay teams, around which the discipline tightens to parade perfection. Behind, the baggage train, the kitchens, the treasurers, the doctors, the tea master with his chests, the falconers, and at fixed points in the column, the pure theatre the age adored. The tossing of the great feathered pikes, spun and exchanged between bearers in stride, a moving juggling act maintained for 400 kilometers because magnificence was the point. The procession was the domain, performing itself to the realm twice every 2 years, and domains near bankrupted themselves on the performance exactly as the shogunate intended. Follow it down the Tokaido, and the road itself unrolls as the piece's masterpiece. 53 post stations between Kyoto and Edo. The 53 stages Hiroshige would print, each a purpose-built town of inns graded like the society they served. The honjin, the appointed lordly inn, its gate and alcove reserved for passing rank. The ordinary inns jostling below it with their maids calling custom into the road. The tea-houses at the famous views. The specialty of every stage, this one's grilled clams, that one's dyed cloth, the next one's famous rice cakes. The guidebooks listed them, for the age invented the travel guidebook too, and the bestseller lists ran to comic novels about 2 scapegrace townsmen eating and blundering their way down this exact road. River crossings where porters carried travellers on shoulders and platforms. Bridges being, on certain rivers, deliberately unbuilt, fords being easier to police. The barrier stations where the shogunate's inspectors enforced the 2 great prohibitions, guns into Edo, women out a fleeing hostage wife being the nightmare the whole system guarded against, and travel papers were checked with a bureaucratic gravity the comic novels mercilessly mined. And along the whole length, the traffic the processions shared the road with. Pilgrims by the million in the great shrine years. Farmers' sons walking to see Ise once in a life. Couriers running relay with mail in lacquered boxes, blind musicians, peddlers, the whole realm circulating on foot along its enforced arteries, so that the highway, built as a leash for 260 lords, became exactly as the Caravanserai Road did on another of this fire's nights, the loom on which a national culture wove itself. One road, one language of inns and guidebooks and prints, one shared repertoire of famous views. The piece walking itself into a nation without once meaning to. What the Tokugawa built after 1615 has no real parallel in world history. A warrior government so successful at eliminating war that it ruled, from first battle to last, over the longest peace any major nation has ever known. 2.5 centuries in which the samurai, a class defined by combat, fought no wars at all. And the fire now enters the long, quiet, endlessly strange heart of tonight's story. What happens to warriors when the war never comes? See the machine first, because it was a masterpiece of applied suspicion. The realm was ordered as a lattice of some 260 domains, each under its daimyo with his castle, his samurai, his revenue. Autonomous in the small, utterly contained in the large. The shogunate held the commanding heights, the great cities, the mines, the foreign ports, a quarter of the land in direct demesne. Castles were limited to 1 per domain. Marriages and fortifications required Edo's license, and over the lords was laid the system's crowning invention, Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance. Every daimyo in the realm was required to reside in Edo every other year, and to leave his wife and heir there permanently. Hostages in silk, held in mansions of magnificent comfort. The genius was less the hostage-taking than the economics. Maintaining 2 full establishments and a biennial procession of hundreds of retainers in state along the highways consumed the domain's surplus as reliably as any tax, leaving no lord the treasure to fund an ambition. And, as an unintended gift, the endless traffic of processions wove the country together. The great roads with their post towns and inns, the spread of Edo fashion and speech to every province, the making of a national culture out of enforced commuting. And around the whole realm, the Tokugawa drew their most famous line, the closed country, alarmed above all by Christianity, which had won hundreds of thousands of converts, and which the regime, watching the Spanish Empire's pattern elsewhere, judged the advance guard of conquest. The shogunate banned the faith, expelled the missionaries, crushed the desperate Christian peasant rising at Shimabara in 1637-38 with a slaughter the fire records and does not dwell in, forbade Japanese to travel abroad, and reduced foreign contact to a trickle. Chinese and Korean trade under license, and a single Dutch trading post confined to a fan-shaped artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. Dejima, a few acres of Europe, through whose narrow gate would pass, for 2 centuries, all the West that Japan chose to receive: telescopes, medical books, world maps, and rumors. Enough, it would turn out, to keep a small flame of foreign knowledge alive among the curious against the day the world came back. Inside the sealed vessel, the samurai settled into the strangest condition of their history. They were now roughly 6 or 7% of the population, a hereditary caste, atop the official order of warrior, farmer, artisan, merchant, distinguished by surname, by dress, and by the 2 swords at the hip that only they might wear. Concentrated in the castle towns, severed from the land, living on hereditary rice stipends measured in koku and paid from the domain warehouse. And they had nothing military to do. The garrisons kept their rosters, the drill grounds their schedules. But decade followed decade without a campaign, and the class transformed under the peace like a river under ice. The samurai became, in daily fact, civil servants. The realm's administrators, magistrates, accountants, teachers, police, and clerks, governing with brush and ledger a country their great-grandfathers had governed with the sword. The fire will spend the coming hours inside this long peace. In the castle towns and the schools, the tea rooms and the theatres, with the swordsmen who became philosophers and the warriors who became poets, with the women of the samurai houses, and with the growing, quiet, structural ironies of the age. A warrior caste sinking into genteel poverty while the despised merchants grew rich. An ideology of martial readiness polished to perfection by men who would never draw a blade in anger. A peace so profound that the sword itself turned inward and became a path of the spirit. It is the least eventful and the most fascinating stretch of the whole samurai story. And it begins, properly, at the castle gate at dawn, on an ordinary day of the ordinary centuries. So let the fire take you there. Before the fire settles into the peace, one object lesson it owes the night: the armor. Because samurai armor is unlike any other armor tradition on Earth, and reading it correctly is reading the class's whole mind. Start with the engineering, which was superb and specific, where Europe answered the same problem with plate: the man encased, a shell of rigid steel. Japan answered with the scale and the cord. Hundreds of small lacquered plates of iron and leather, punched and laced together with kilometers of silk or leather braid into a harness that was not a shell but a fabric of armor, flexible at every joint, breathing in the summer campaigns, light enough for the horse and, later, the climb up a castle wall. The lacquer sealing the iron against the humid island climate that would have eaten European plate in a season. The great early harness, the O-Yoroi of the Genpei horse archers, was a box for a saddle-borne bowman, the huge shoulder guards that swung back with the draw and swung forward as shields, the skirt of plate spread over the horse's flanks. When the gun and the pike remade war, the armor remade itself within a generation. The Tozei Gusoku, the modern equipment of the Sengoku. Simpler, more solid plates, bullet-tested cuirasses, proof marks, actual dents from test shots, survive on museum pieces, mass-producible for the Ashigaru armies. The whole tradition demonstrating, once again, the class's underrated pragmatism. Whatever the legend says of tradition, the samurai re-equipped as ruthlessly as any modern army. But the engineering is the lesser half. Samurai armor is the most expressive armor ever made, and it meant to be. The lacing itself was language, its colors and patterns. Crimson, white, purple, the graded shading called omadeka, identified houses and ranks at bowshot distance. An armor was commissioned like a poem, and the great harnesses have names and biographies, donated to shrines, treasured as heirlooms, and they hang today in museums still fierce and still gorgeous. And above everything, literally, the helmet. The kabuto began as a practical bowl and became, in the warring age, the wildest sculpture gallery in military history. For a battlefield of 100,000 men needed its commanders visible, and the commanders competed. Crests of gilded antlers and water buffalo horns, a helmet built as a giant crayfish, as Fudo's flaming sword, as a conch shell, a mountain, a monstrous catfish tail, the great Lord Maeda's, and men followed it through the smoke, vast sunbursts and crescent moons. The date's crescent of the one-eyed dragon of the north among the most famous shapes in Japan, and beneath the crest, the face, the mengu, the iron mask. Half face or full, wrinkled and mustached into the scowl of a demon or the grimace of an old god, partly to anchor the heavy helmet's cords, partly to armor the face, and wholly to complete the transformation the entire ensemble intended. The man inside disappearing into an ancestor spirit, a guardian demon, a thing from beyond the battlefield glaring through iron. The knight's first image. The warrior in the snow, black-masked, crested, plated in crimson-laced scales, was not a man dressed for protection. He was a man dressed as the house itself, its colours, its crest, its accumulated dead walking. That is what armour meant to the samurai, and why, in the long peace, it stood in the storeroom like a shrine. And why, at the year's inspection parade, when Genzo put on his grandfather's harness for a morning, the ledger keeper and the ancestor briefly shared a skin. One quiet achievement of the vanished world deserves its own hour, because it shaped the modern nation more than any battle. The Edo peace turned Japan into one of the most literate societies the pre-modern world ever produced, and it did so from the bottom as much as the top. Begin with the samurai, for whom literacy became identity. A caste with nothing military to do needed another justification, and found it in learning. The domain schools multiplied across the peace. Hundreds of them by the end, teaching the sons and, increasingly, in their own establishments, the daughters of the warrior class, the Confucian classics, Chinese history, mathematics, calligraphy, and the domain's own administrative forms. A samurai boy's day was the brush, the abacus, and the wooden sword, in proportions that shifted steadily toward the brush as the centuries passed. The Neo-Confucian orthodoxy the shogunate promoted gave the whole thing its frame. A philosophy of hierarchy, obligation, and self-cultivation, congenial to a ruling class that needed its rule to seem natural and its members to seem worthy. But the schools produced more than obedience. They produced scholars, and the scholars argued. Rival academies, dissenting schools of thought, the nativist movement that turned from the Chinese classics back to Japan's own ancient texts and, in studying them, slowly rebuilt the idea of the emperor that would one day end the shogunate. The regime's own educational machine, in other words, incubated the ideas that overthrew it, which is a pattern this fire has watched all night. But the deeper marvel was below the samurai, in the commoners' schools. The terracotta, the temple schools, though most were run by teachers rather than temples. Thousands upon thousands of small neighborhood schools, in towns and villages alike, where merchants and craftsmen and even farmers' children learned to read, write, and reckon, paying the teacher in coin or kind, using textbooks pitched to their futures. The merchant's letter forms, the farmer's almanac, the moral primers. No state compelled it. Demand built it. Because a commercializing society running on contracts, account books, guidebooks, and printed entertainment needed readers, and made them. The results, by the piece's end, were extraordinary for any pre-industrial society. Literacy rates in the cities that rivaled or exceeded the advanced nations of Europe. A publishing industry of astonishing vigor. Lending libraries, carrying books to villages, bestsellers in the tens of thousands, comic novels and travel guides and how-to manuals for every craft and pleasure. A whole population, high and low, that read. And when the Meiji Revolution came and demanded, overnight, a modern nation of literate soldiers, clerks, and factory hands, the foundation was already poured. The new state built the world's fastest universal school system on top of a country that had, without being ordered to, largely taught itself to read. The samurai perfected learning as the badge of a class. The commoners spread it as the tool of a life. And between them they left the vanished world's most practical bequest. A nation ready, when the ships came, to read the instructions. Let the fire assemble everything into one lived day. An ordinary day around the year 1750 in a middling castle town, in the life of a middling samurai of the long peace. Built from the household diaries and domain records the age left in such abundance. Call him Gendo. His stipend is 150 koku on the books. His actual life is as follows. He wakes before dawn in a modest house in the samurai quarter. The band of walled lanes below the castle, graded by rank so precisely that a glance at a gate tells a neighbour's stipend. Cold water at the well, hair dressed and oiled into the shaved pate topknot, without which no samurai is dressed at all, the kimono and divided hakama trousers, the household crest at 5 points, and then the 2 swords, taken up from their rack with a small habitual bow, the long katana, the short wakizashi, thrust through the sash edge up, worn now to the office as his grandfather wore them to the siege lines. Breakfast is rice, miso, soup, pickles. The stipend does not run to more, and the fire will come back to that. At the hour of the dragon he walks to the castle, through the quarter as it wakes, exchanging bows calibrated to the exact degree each rank owes each rank, past the moat where the herons stand, through the great gate where the guards, samurai like himself, on the duty roster, check his passage with ritual solemnity, though they have known him 30 years. His post is the domain finance office. He is, in the plain modern words, an accountant. His morning is rice tax ledgers from the northern villages, a dispute over flood-damaged assessments, a draft memorial to the domain elders on the deficit. The domain, like nearly every domain in Japan, spends more than it takes, borrows from Osaka merchants against next year's rice, and economizes on its retainers' stipends. Genzo's own has been borrowed back at 30% for a decade, a politeness meaning cut. He writes a fine hand. His calligraphy teacher was strict, and promotion in the piece runs on brush, precedent, and patience, not valour. His sword he has drawn, in earnest, never, though he trains dutifully, and tonight is his fencing night. At midday, rice from a lacquered box. Office gossip in low voices. A colleague's son adopted into a wealthier house, the new play in the merchant quarter, the magistrate's verdict in the moneylender's case. In the afternoon, he is sent into the town on office business, and the town is where the age shows its true face. The merchant streets are richer than his own. Silks in the draper's windows he could not buy. The moneylender's establishment he must visit bowing, as protocol requires, while needing handsomer than his lord's guest hall. The official order of the world puts Genzo above these people, and the actual order of the world has been quietly reversing the ranking for a century, and everyone in the street knows both facts and observes both sets of manners, and the small daily friction of that double truth is the underground weather of the whole era. Evening is his own. First the fencing hall, 2 hours in the dojo of his domain's school, kata and paired drill with bamboo and wooden blades, the master correcting a wrist's angle with 2 fingers. The sword now a discipline, a lineage, an examination subject, its combat purpose grown as abstract as Latin grammar and pursued with the same scholastic passion. Then, once a week as tonight, the other lesson, poetry. A circle of colleagues at a teacher's house, composing linked verse in the plain style, tea and a little sake, an hour in which rank loosens, and the finance clerk who corrected his ledger may be corrected in turn on a season word by the gate guard who checked his pass. He walks home under the first lamps, the town soft lit, the castle black against stars, the pleasure quarter's distant music where he does not often go, a bath, the accounts of his own household reviewed with his wife, whose management of their genteel scarcity is, as the age's own moralists admitted, the real defence of the house, a last pipe by the brazier. His armour stands in its box in the storeroom, inherited, immaculate, worn once a year in the New Year's inspection parade. His swords go back on their rack with the same small bow. He has served his lord this day, as his ancestors did, with an abacus, and if there is an ache in that, somewhere under the routine, he does not name it, though the age's literature named it constantly on his behalf. He sleeps. The castle town sleeps around him, one of 260, in a realm asleep in the deepest peace on earth. That is the samurai in the long noon of his class. and the fire finds him in his ledgers and his linked verse, at least as remarkable as his grandfather in the siege lines. Because history is full of men who mastered war, and has produced exactly one warrior caste that mastered peace. Of all the arts the warrior class took into itself, one became its inmost chamber, and the fire enters it now, shoes off, head bowed under the low door, the way of tea. Understand first what tea had been: a monk's medicine, a Zen monastery's aid to wakefulness, then a warlord's luxury. The Sengoku great collected Chinese tea utensils as they collected provinces, and a famed tea caddy could be, quite literally, the price of a castle. Nobunaga awarded tea vessels to victorious generals as fiefs of prestige, and permission to hold a tea gathering was itself a political honor. Into this world of gold and competition came the greatest aesthetic revolutionary in Japanese history, Sen no Rikyu, a merchant's son of the port of Sakai, who became tea master to Hideyoshi himself, and who, from inside the golden court he served, without visible irony, in the regent's portable gilded tea room, perfected the exact opposite, wabi-cha, the tea of quiet poverty. Rikyu shrank the tea room to a hut of mud walls and paper, 4.5 mats, then smaller. He replaced the priceless Chinese porcelains with Korean peasant rice bowls and the work of a Kyoto tilemaker, fired rough and glazed dark, each bowl asymmetric, each unique, finding in the humble and the imperfect a depth the flawless could not reach. He made the entrance a crawling door 2 feet high, so that every guest, daimyo or merchant, must bow to enter and leave his swords on the rack outside. The only room in Japan where the warrior went unarmed and rank crossed the threshold last. Inside, a kettle's breath, a single flower in a bamboo vase, 1 scroll in the alcove, the host's every movement pared over a lifetime to the necessary, and no more. The whole gathering governed by the 4 characters Rikyu left as the way's heart: harmony, respect, purity, stillness. And by the phrase the tradition distilled from Zen for it: ichai go ichai, 1 meeting, 1 time. This gathering, these guests, this steam rising, never again in all the world. Therefore, complete attention. Therefore, a cup of tea drunk as if it were the whole of life, because the teaching means it. It is. That such a practice conquered the samurai class is the deepest single fact about them. The tea room became the warrior's counterworld. Lords built them in castle gardens at the end of winding roji paths designed to shed the world step by step. The tea master became a fixture of every great household. Connoisseurship of bowl and scroll became as much a samurai accomplishment as horsemanship had been. And the pieces officials, the genzos at their ledgers, found in the 4.5 mats the hour their ancestors had found in the meditation hall, the unarmed, unranked, unhurried centre of an armoured life. And the way's founding has its dark ending, which the fire tells because the age was what it was. In 1591, Hideyoshi, for reasons still argued, a slight, a statue, a refusal, the intolerable independence of a merchant who outranked power in the one-room power could not enter, ordered Rikyu to die. The master held a final tea gathering, presented each guest a utensil, smashed his own bowl that it might never serve a lesser meeting, wrote a death poem, and cut his belly at 70. His tradition survived him through his descendants. The tea schools they founded teach his forms, unbroken, to this day, in every country on earth, so that the tyrant's sentence proved, in the long run, the emptiest ever passed. The golden regent's monuments are ash and tourist stone, and the merchant's bowl of tea is still being whisked, this evening, somewhere near you, in the stillness he designed. One more art of the piece demands its own hour, because it is the smallest and travelled farthest, 17 syllables, and the man who made them immortal. And he began, fittingly for tonight, as a samurai. Matsuo Basho was born in 1644, a minor samurai's son in the castle town of Ueno, and entered service as companion to his lord's young heir, 2 youths studying poetry together. When the young lord died at 25, Basho walked away from the warrior path entirely, gave up status and stipend, and spent the rest of his life as something the age had no clean category for. A poet-teacher-wanderer, living in a hut his students built him beside a banana tree. The basho from which he took his name, and refining the popular linked verse pastime of the day into the profoundest short poetry in any language. The haiku's rule is a handful of sounds, 5, 7, 5, a season word and a cut. 2 images set side by side with a gap the reader's mind must leap. And Basho's revolution was what he asked the leap to carry. Not wit, which the form had lived on, but the thing the tea masters and the Zen halls had been circling all along. The moment itself, caught barehanded. The old pond. A frog jumps in. The sound of water. His most famous poem is, notoriously, almost nothing. And generations of readers in every language have found that the almost nothing opens. The silence before, the sound, the silence after, the whole of impermanence in a splash. On the withered branch a crow has settled. Autumn evening. Summer grasses. All that remains of warriors' dreams. That one he wrote standing on the ruined battlefield where Yoshitsune died, 5 centuries after our Genpei hours, and it may be the shortest Great War elegy ever made. And he wrote it because he walked there, which is the second half of his gift to the age and to tonight. In his 40s, frail and famous, Basho gave away his hut and took to the roads of the peace on foot. The great pilgrimage journeys, above all the 5-month, 2,000-kilometre arc through the wild north that became the narrow road to the deep north. The slender travel diary, prose braided with haiku, that Japan reveres as the perfection of its literature of the road. He walked the same highways as the daimyo processions. The checkpoints, the post-ins, the straw sandals worn out by the pair. But in the opposite spirit, travel not as duty, but as practice. Every day's walking a discipline of attention. The journey itself, he wrote in its first lines, is home. The months and days are the travellers of eternity, and the years that come and go are voyagers too. He visited the moon-viewing places and the ruined forts, wept at the sights the old poems had taught him to weep at, was rained on, was phleboton, he made the fleas a poem, and died on the road at 50, in Osaka, mid-journey as he wished, leaving a last verse, sick on a journey. My dreams go wandering over withered fields. The samurai class produced many kinds of greatness. The fire suspects none will outlast this one. Not the castles, not the sword schools, not even the films. The Lord's companion who laid down the sword, walked into the weather, and taught the world that 17 syllables, honestly attended, can hold a season, a death, a frog, and the whole floating world, and whose smallest poems are recited tonight, in every language on earth, by people who have never heard of Sekigahara. The fire has kept the most famous object in the whole story waiting deliberately, because the katana deserves to be met as the age met it, last and with both truth and wonder intact. What, actually, was the samurai sword? Begin at the forge, because the craft is genuinely among the summits of the world's metalwork, and no debunking touches it. The Japanese smith worked from tamahagane, jewel steel, smelted over days in a clay furnace from iron, sand and charcoal, and his art was the marriage of opposites. Steel hard enough to take a razor edge is brittle. Steel tough enough to survive impact is soft, and the solution, refined across centuries, was to give the blade both natures at once. The smith folded his steel, hammering, cutting, folding, welding, a dozen and more times, each fold doubling the layers into the thousands, driving out impurity and evening the carbon until the metal carried a grain like wood or flowing water. He wrapped harder steel around a softer core, and then the act that made the sword a sword, the clay. Before quenching, the smith painted the blade with a slurry, thick along the spine, feather thin along the edge, so that when the glowing steel plunged into the trough, the edge cooled in an instant into crystalline hardness, while the clay-blanketed body cooled slow and tough. And the differential quench did 2 things at once. It curved the blade. The katana's sweep is not carved but born, the steel bending itself in the water as the 2 natures set. And it drew along the edge the heiman, the temper line, a misted frontier between the two steels, unique to every blade, running like a mountain range seen far off or surf along a night beach. Polishers would spend weeks bringing it to light, and connoisseurs would read blades the way the age read calligraphy. The great smiths signed their tangs and became immortals. Masamune of Kamakura, above all, whose name in Japan means what Stradivarius means elsewhere. Legend duly grew a rival, Muramasa, whose blades were said to hunger and cut their own bearers, and Edo storytellers set the two in contests no history records. The Muramasa blade held in a stream cuts every leaf the current brings. The Masamune cuts none. The leaves part around it unharmed. And the judgment is that the lesser sword cuts what it can, the greater need not cut at all, which is not metallurgy, and is the whole samurai ideal in a single image. Now the honest ledger. Was the katana the supreme battlefield weapon of legend? No, and the samurai themselves would have been puzzled by the question. Their battles were won, era by era, by the bow, the spear, and then the gun. The sword was the sidearm, the weapon of the press, the pursuit, the duel, the last resort. Battle records of the warring age count sword wounds far below arrow, spear, and gunshot. The cult of the blade as the soul of the samurai is, in large part, a child of the peace. When the Tokugawa order made the paired swords the badge of caste, the one visible line between Genzo and the richer merchant he bowed to, the sword's meaning migrated from the hand to the identity, and it was in the peace that swordsmanship became a way. The great schools codifying their transmissions, and the masters writing the books that fused blade and zen for all time. Miyamoto Musashi, the duelist of Legend 60 Bouts Unbeaten, the most famous against Sasaki Kojiro on a tidal islet, fought, the story insists, with a wooden sword carved from an oar on the boat ride over, who ended as a hermit painting austere ink shrikes and writing the Book of Five Rings, and the Yagyu masters, fencing teachers to the shoguns, whose treatises teach that the art perfected is the life-giving sword. The blade whose mastery makes drawing it unnecessary. The Masamune of the stream, taught as curriculum. That is the katana's true history, a magnificent craft, a modest battlefield tool, and then, precisely as the wars ended, the concentrated symbol of an entire class's meaning, so that when, at our story's end, a modernizing government bans the wearing of swords, it will be striking not at a weapon but at a soul, and the age will end, fittingly, over the object that mattered most when it was used least. Before the second rest, one more art the warrior class made its own, and perhaps the strangest, the no theatre, the slowest, most distilled drama on earth, and for 4 centuries the official stagecraft of the samurai state. It came together in the 14th century under the Ashikaga shoguns, perfected by a father and son. Kanami and, above all, Zimi, who was taken up as a beautiful boy actor by a shogun and grew into one of the great dramatists and theorists in any language. What they made has no real parallel. A masked, chanted, danced drama of extreme economy, performed on a bare cedar stage with a single painted pine for backdrop, in which almost nothing, by the standards of other theatres, happens. And everything, by its own, does. A travelling monk arrives at a place, a stranger appears, and speaks in poetry of what happened here long ago. And in the second half, the stranger returns in true form. A ghost, a demon, a god, the spirit of a warrior or a wronged woman, to live the old grief or glory once more, in dance, and be, at the last, released. The pace is glacial and deliberate, a single step, the heel lowered with infinite control across the polished boards. The mask, those famous carved faces, the young woman, the vengeful spirit, the old man, cut so subtly that a tilt of the actor's head turns grief to peace before your eyes, the chorus chanting at the side, the flute and the drums with their unearthly calls and silences, and time itself seeming to thicken and slow until an hour on the no stage feels like standing at the bottom of a deep, clear, cold pool. Why did the samurai love it? Because it was theirs in temper. Its great subject was exactly their worlds, the ghosts of warriors above all. the Genpei dead returning to the stage they died on, the Heiki's tragedies danced by their own spirits, the pathos of things given a body and a voice, a whole cycle of warrior plays let the piece's swordless samurai commune with their fighting ancestors in the only way left. Its aesthetic was Zen's. Suggestion over statement, emptiness as fullness, the profound simplicity the tradition called yujin, a word that means something like the beauty of the dimly seen, the mysterious depth glimpsed and not grasped. Zimi's own treatises on the actor's art, secret texts passed down within the acting houses for centuries, read as Zen manuals as much as stagecraft. His central image, the flower, meaning the living bloom of a performance that a lifetime's discipline exists only to make appear effortless, and then, at the right moment, to let fall. The Tokugawa made know their ceremonial theatre. Every great domain kept its actors and its stages, samurai trained in its chant and dance as accomplishments. And it survives, unbroken, tonight. Performed on the same bare stages, in the same masks, some of them the very masks, 4 and 5 centuries old, worn by actors descended from actors, at the same otherworldly pace, for audiences who come, as the samurai came, to sit in the deep cold pool of it and watch a ghost be, at last, set free. It is the warrior class's stillness made visible, an entire theatre built to teach the hardest lesson of their world in this night, how to let the flower fall. And here, at the piece's deep centre, the fire rests again. The second stillness of the night, and this time it is not snow, but summer. Come into a castle town garden at the end of a warm evening. A small one, behind a middling samurai house, Genzo's, if you like. The paper lanterns are lit along the veranda, a soft procession of amber moons. The stone lantern by the pond holds its own small flame behind carved windows, and the garden is doing what Japanese gardens are for, being a world complete in 12 paces, the pond a sea, the mossed rock an island mountain, the single pine trained through 40 years into the shape of wind. The day's heat is lifting off the stones. Cicadas, which shrilled all afternoon, have handed the dark to the crickets, whose sound is smaller and rounder, like beads told one by one. The pond turtle surfaces, considers the lantern light, and descends without a ripple worth the name. Somewhere beyond the wall, the town is putting itself away. A far dog, wooden sandals crossing a bridge, unhurried, a street seller's last call, melodious and giving up. Inside the house, the lamps are low. The household is settling. Someone rinses a tea bowl, and the small ring of it carries out to the veranda like a temple bell scaled to a garden. Sit on the veranda's edge with the evening. This, the fire wants it felt rather than argued, is what the whole vast machinery of the age was for. The surveys and the hostage processions, the rosters and the sworn oaths, the closed ports and the 260 castles. All of it, whatever its makers intended, cashed out here in a minor official's garden on a summer night as the rarest commodity in the history of the world, an ordinary evening in an ordinary town in the 211th year of a peace. No beacon will light on the hills tonight. No levy will come up the road. The armour in the storeroom will not be needed in the lifetime of anyone breathing this air, and everyone breathing it half knows that, and the knowledge lives in the town's whole posture. In gardens tended like heirlooms, in fencing practiced like poetry, in poetry practiced like fencing. Rest in it as long as you like. The lanterns are patient. The crickets are in no hurry. The pine holds its trained shape against the stars as it has for 40 years and will for 40 more. The piece has lasted 2 centuries and will keep till morning without your help. When the story rises again, it will rise with a sail on the horizon. The world, coming back for Japan at last. But the horizon is far from this garden, and the night between is long, and it belongs, all of it, to the lantern, the pond, and the small bright ring of the rinsed bowl, fading now, fading into the round dark hum of the crickets. History filed the samurai under men, and then the records. House documents, temple rolls, battlefield archaeology, the women's own letters and death poems. Quietly refiled the truth, and the fire gives this hour to the women of the warrior world who ran it, defended it, and sometimes died for it with the same steel as their brothers and rather less applause. Begin with the fighters, because they were real. The naginata, the long glaive, a curved blade on a 2-meter shaft, was the woman's weapon of the warrior house. Reach enough to hold a corridor or a gate against a swordsman, and every samurai daughter of standing trained in it. In the warring centuries, when the men marched out, the defense of the house, walls, stores, servants, children, honor, was the wife's command, and the sieges of the age assaulted with accounts of it. Tomoe Gozen rode through our Genpei hours, worth 1,000, taking heads at her lord's last stand. The Heike gives her to us plainly as a commander, and later ages, unable to decide whether to worship or domesticate her, did both. At the siege of a northern castle in 1189, the woman remembered as Hangaku Gozen held a tower with a bow, dropping attackers, the chronicle says, with shot after shot until an arrow took her. Brought captive before the shogun's court, she so impressed a warrior there that he asked for her in marriage. In the Sengoku, the Lady Inao Tora ruled her clan outright as female lord when its men were dead. Tachibana Ginchiyo inherited a domain at 7 and its retainers knelt to her. And at the very end of our story, hold her name for the final battles. A schoolteacher's daughter named Nakano Takeko will lead a spontaneous corps of women with naginata against rifle fire, and her memorial will stand today beside her sisters. Archaeology has added its blunt testimony. Excavations at battle sites have turned up remains identified as female among the fallen combatants. In some famous digs, a striking share of them, scholars argue the counts, as they should. The presence is no longer arguable. But the deeper truth of the samurai woman was not the naginata, it was the house itself. In the early warrior centuries, women of the Buke held property in their own right, inherited land, and passed it on. The Kamakura records show women as landholders, litigants, and even jito, estate stewards, in their own names. The age's most formidable political figure may have been a widow. Hojo Masako, wife of the first shogun Yoritomo, who after his death took holy orders and proceeded to rule, deposing one of her own sons, outmaneuvering a retired emperor's uprising with a single famous speech to the assembled vassals, so plainly the master of the realm that history calls her the nun shogun. The centuries that followed narrowed the formal ground. Warring age inheritance consolidated on single male heirs. Edo law and Neo-Confucian doctrine preached the obedient wife and measured a samurai woman's virtue in submission. The conduct books are explicit, and the fire reports them without softening. And then it reports the rest of the record, which the conduct books did not control. The Edo samurai household ran on the wife. The stipend stretched, the debts managed, the servants governed, the education of children begun at her knee. The letters and diaries show partnerships, businesses in all but name, and formidable dowagers before whom domain officials trod carefully. The ideal said shadow, the ledgers say steward. Both were true at once, in the proportions every patriarchal age actually lives. And when the end came for the whole samurai world, the women of the class would meet it. At Aizu, in the burning castle, with the naginata and with a composure the conquerors themselves recorded in awe, as its full members, which they had always been. The fire's oldest rule now calls the largest witness of all. Tonight's story has lived among the 6 or 7%, and the peace it has praised was carried, every koku of it, on the backs of the other 93. So let this hour belong to the village, without which there is no stipend, no castle, no tea room, and no story. The Tokugawa order rested on a single transaction, endlessly repeated. The village grew rice. The domain took a share. Nominally 40 or 50% of the assessed yield, in practice a thicket of rates, surcharges, and negotiations. And everything samurai in tonight's telling was purchased with that share. The village met the state as a unit. The domain taxed the village, not the farmer, and left the sharing out, the record-keeping, and the everyday governing to the village's own officials. The headman, the elders, the 5 household groups mutually responsible for each other's conduct and arrears, which meant, in practice, that rural Japan largely administered itself, kept its own meticulous registers. The population data of Edo Japan is among the best of any pre-modern society, because the villages counted themselves, settled most disputes without ever seeing a samurai magistrate, and developed a deep bench of literate, numerate, self-governing peasant leadership. A fact that would matter enormously to the modern country these villages would shortly build. Daily life ran on the agricultural year's great wheel, the spring flooding and transplanting. Whole villages in the paddies together, the planting songs, the festival that blessed the seedlings, the summer of weeding, night soil carrying the city's waste sold back to the fields in one of history's most complete recycling economies, and prayers against the two dreads, drought and locust, the autumn cutting, drying, threshing, and the assessor's visit, the year's true judgment day, the winter of by-employments that were quietly remaking the economy, silk reeling, weaving, paper, sake, soy. The farmhouse becoming a workshop, the workshop feeding the towns. The ledger's dark column is real and the fire enters it plainly. The margin was thin, and when the harvest failed, the village starved before the castle did. The great famines of the era, Kyoho, Tenmei, Tempo, killed by the 100,000, drove the desperate to the cities and left in the records the practices the age itself mourned. Infants the poor could not feed, returned, as the grim euphemism ran, to the gods. And when the burden past bearing, the villages rose. The Ikki, peasant protest and revolt, runs through the piece by the 1,000 incidents, and it had its own austere theatre. Petitions carried over the heads of local officials directly to the Lord, an act of capital illegality even when the petition was granted. The leaders knowing and going anyway. Sakura Sogoro, the headman who, so the legend of the age tells it, carried his starving district's petition to the shogun himself and was executed with his family for the manner of the appeal, and then enshrined, worshipped, and staged in kabuki as a god of the wronged. Is the counter-hero the era set beside its 47, loyalty running upward given its monument, justice demanded from below given its own? Hold the village beside everything the night has admired. Hold Genzo's stipend and the tea-room's stillness against the paddies that paid for them. And the fire's summing is the one it always gives. The peace was real, and its price was real, and the people who paid it kept, in their registers and their songs and their capacity to rise, a dignity the official order never granted and never extinguished. And when the samurai class dissolved into history, it was the village's literate, self-governing, long-suffering sons who walked into the conscript army and the new schools and inherited the country. Which is, the fire submits, as close to justice as these long stories usually come. The piece had a shadow population, and the age could not stop telling stories about it. The ronin, the wave men, samurai without a lord, drifting like the waves they were named for. A domain confiscated, a house abolished, a stipend ended, and a warrior became, overnight, a man with 2 swords, a caste, and no place, forbidden by status to farm or trade without descending, unhirable in a realm at peace with warriors to spare. The early Tokugawa decades, with their great confiscations, threw hundreds of thousands of men into this condition. The desperate ones filled Osaka Castle for the last Toyotomi stand. The talented ones became fencing teachers, scholars, bodyguards, monks. Musashi himself walked his 60 duels as a ronin. The unlucky slid into the underworld the kabuki stage loved. The ronin was the age's loose thread and its favourite character, freedom and ruin in one silhouette. And in the winter of 1703, the loose thread pulled the whole tapestry. In the incident that became, and remains, the most famous samurai story ever told, the 47 Ronin. The facts, first, as the record gives them. In 1701, in Edo Castle itself, the young provincial lord Asano of Akko drew his sword against the shogunate's senior master of ceremonies, Kira. Provoked, the tradition insists, by Kira's insults and corruption, wounding him slightly. Drawing steel in the castle was capital. Asano was ordered to commit seppuku that same day, his domain confiscated, His 300-odd samurai made ronin at a stroke, while Kira went unpunished. And the one-sidedness of that verdict is the spark of everything that followed. Asano's chief retainer, Wishi, publicly dispersed the band, drank, divorced, played the broken idler in Kyoto's pleasure quarters so convincingly that Kira's spies relaxed, and in secret held 46 others to a sworn purpose through nearly 2 years. And on a snowy night in December 1702, they assembled in Edo, stormed Kira's mansion in a coordinated 2-gate assault, found the old man hiding in a charcoal shed, took his head and carried it through the dawn streets to lay on their master's grave, then turned themselves in, as they had always intended. The shogunate faced a dilemma the whole country argued in real time. The men had fulfilled the era's highest professed ideal, loyalty unto death, by committing its gravest crime, private vengeance and conspiracy against public order. Scholars filed opinions. The townsmen made them folk heroes before the verdict fell. The judgment, when it came, was the age in miniature. They were condemned, and permitted seppuku, the honourable death, rather than execution. 46 cut their bellies on the same day, the 47th, sent home as messenger, lived to old age, and lies now beside them, and were buried around their lord at Sengakuji in Edo, where the incense at their graves has not been allowed to die out from that day to this. Within weeks, the theatres were staging it in transparent disguise. The puppet and kabuki masterpiece Chushingura became the most performed work in the Japanese repertoire. The nation's default drama, revived in every medium since film upon film, and the fire notes the meaning under the fame. The piece's great samurai story is not a battle, but a question. What does loyalty owe when law and honour split? Asked by men whose class had been built on the answer being simple and staged, forever after, precisely because it no longer was. The samurai's Edo was the castle and the ledger, but the age built a second city alongside the first, and no honest portrait of the piece can leave it out, because the floating world, the ukiyo, was where the era's genius actually went to play, and the samurai's relationship to it was the great open secret of the age. The word itself is the era in one pun. Ukiyo had meant, in Buddhist usage, the sorrowful world, this transient veil to be endured. The Edo townsmen took the same sounds and rewrote the character to mean the floating world. Transient, yes, so float, the world of the pleasure quarters and the theatres, of fashion and fireworks, of everything gloriously impermanent, enjoyed precisely because it would not last. Its capitals were the licensed quarters. Edo's Yoshiwara, the most famous, a walled, moated, gated district, the moat, everyone understood, faced both ways where the strict sumptuary order of the Tokugawa world inverted after dark. Here the despised merchant's gold outranked the samurai's swords, which had, by regulation, to be checked at the gate or disguised, along with the visitor's face under a deep wicker hat, since samurai were officially discouraged from entering and unofficially kept the place solvent. Reigning over the quarter were the great courtesans, the Aran and, later and separately, the geisha, who were by definition artists, musicians and dancers and mistresses of conversation, and whose culture the age graded with a connoisseurship as elaborate as the tea ceremonies. The highest-ranked women were celebrities in the exact modern sense. Their processions through the quarter in towering lacquered clogs were public spectacles. Their fashions set the nations, their portraits sold in the thousands. The fire keeps its two-sided ledger here as everywhere, and states the dark side plainly. Beneath the silk and the poetry, the quarters ran on indenture. Girls sold by poor families on term contracts, their freedom priced, their lives regulated and often short. The floating world floated on that, and the age knew it, and its own literature said so. The great double suicide plays that packed the theatres were about exactly this. Love against the ledger, the lovers choosing the one exit the system left them. Those theatres were the floating world's other pole, kabuki. Born, the tradition says, from a woman's dance troupe on a Kyoto riverbed at the era's dawn, banned to women within decades, the authorities citing morals and flowering thereafter as the all-male spectacle that became the townsman's opera. revolving stages and trapdoors, the runway through the audience, the actors' dynasties whose names passed down numbered like kings, the stylized poses held at climax while the audience roars the house name, and a repertoire that mirrored the age to itself, the 47 ronin in transparent disguise, the double suicides torn from last season's scandal, and, in the history plays, samurai more samurai than any living samurai. The stage, with the swords locked out of it, perfecting the warrior ideal as entertainment for the classes below. And the whole floating world was distributed nationwide by the era's great mass medium, the woodblock print, ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. Actor portraits and courtesan fashion plates sold for the price of a bowl of noodles, publishers and artist workshops feeding a genuinely popular market. Until, in the tradition's late golden age, the landscape masters turned the same cheap medium on the country itself. Hokusai's great wave curling over the boats with the small perfect Fuji behind it, printed in its thousands, and now the most reproduced image in the history of art. Hiroshiji's rain-slanted bridges and snowy post stations along the very highways the daimyo processions walked. The piece looking at its own roads and finding them beautiful. When Japan opened, it was these prints, packed as wrapping paper, the story goes, around export porcelain, that reached Paris first and rewired Western art. The floating world, dismissed by the official order as the frivolous underside of the realm, turned out to be the part the world would fall in love with, which is the fire notes, the usual fate of official orders, and one more sense in which the townsman quietly won the peace. Before the black ships, the fire owes a closer look at the keyhole, because the closed country was never quite closed, and what passed through the fan-shaped island at Nagasaki shaped everything about how Japan met the ships when they came. Dejima was absurd and momentous in equal measure. A few acres of reclaimed harbour fill, fan-shaped because the Shogun, the story goes, waved a fan when asked what to build. One bridge to the shore, one gate, guarded. And on it, for over 2 centuries, the entire Western presence in Japan. A Dutch East India Company post of 12 Europeans at a time, their year built around the arrival of 1 or 2 ships from Batavia, their lives inventoried, translated, and watched. The Dutch endured the confinement for the monopoly profits and paid the strangest rent in commercial history. The court journey, the Opperhoofd, the chief factor, travelling every year later, every 4th in procession to Edo to perform obeisance before the shogun, the audiences sometimes descending, the factor's diaries record with gritted teeth into command performances, the Europeans made to sing, dance, and demonstrate their manners for the ladies behind the screens. But the traffic that mattered flowed the other way, and it began with a book. In 1720, the shogunate relaxed the ban on foreign volumes religion accepted, and there grew up, around the Nagasaki interpreters, and then far beyond them, the movement called Rangaku. Dutch learning. Japanese scholars teaching themselves a European language through the keyhole, then teaching it to each other to read the West's science. The founding legend is the anatomy. In 1771, a group of physicians attending the dissection of an executed criminal held a Dutch anatomical atlas open beside the body, saw organ after organ match the plates and contradict the Chinese classics, and resolved on the spot to translate the book, which they did over 4 agonizing years, with a vocabulary of a few hundred words and no dictionary, coining Japanese terms for nerve and cartilage that the language uses today. From that seed, schools of Dutch medicine, astronomy, chemistry, ballistics, imported clocks, telescopes, electrical machines demonstrated at fairs, a national map of Japan, surveyed on foot over 17 years by a retired sake merchant turned geographer, so accurate that a British survey ship decades later checked its own charts against it and gave up improving on them. So when Perry's smoke appeared on the horizon, Japan was not. This is the point of the hour. A sleeping country woken by a shout. It was a locked country that had spent a century pressing its best minds to the keyhole. The men who would seize the Meiji Revolution were disproportionately Rangaku trained or Rangaku taught, and the fabled speed of Japan's modernization, decades, where centuries were expected, was possible because the translation was, in every sense, already begun. The fan-shaped island did what keyholes do. It let in exactly enough light to keep the eye trained on the door. On the 8th of July, 1853, the 250th year of the peace, watchers on the headlands at the mouth of Edo Bay saw the future arrive. 4 warships standing in against the wind, 2 of them moving without sails, coal smoke rolling from their stacks, paddle wheels beating the water, black-hulled, gun-decked, and utterly indifferent to the boats that swarmed out ordering them away. The townsmen's broadsheets named them instantly and forever the Black Ships. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy had come, with a letter from his president and instructions not to take no, to open Japan, to steam, to trade, to coaling stations, to the 19th century. He delivered the letter with calibrated theatre, refused all deflection, promised to return with a larger fleet for the answer, and did, months early, with 8 ships. The shogunate, whose guns could not reach the anchorage and knew it, signed. The European powers followed the Americans through the open door within the season, and the treaties that resulted. Ports opened, tariffs fixed from outside, foreigners exempt from Japanese law, were of the kind the age called unequal because they were, and every literate samurai in Japan could read in them the exact terms being imposed. That same decade, on a china being carved like a melon. The 15 years that followed were the death throes of the old order, and the fire will walk them at pace, because the pace is the point. No ruin in this whole night story fell faster. The shogunate's authority, resting for centuries on the fiction of barbarians subduing supremacy, bled from the wound of visible helplessness. The treaty ports brought inflation, cholera, and humiliation, and from the domains of the old southwestern periphery. Satsuma and Choshu, above all, the very houses Sekigahara had exiled to the edges 2.5 centuries before, their grudge kept warm across 10 generations. Rose the movement that would end everything under a slogan of perfect, fatal clarity: Sono Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. Young samurai. The shishi, men of high purpose, mostly low-ranking, book-fed on loyalist history, sword-fed on the fencing revival, poured into the capital streets. Assassinations of shogunal officials and foreign traders by night, reprisals, the Shinzengumi swordsmen hunting them through Kyoto's lanes. The last, strange, gaslit flowering of the jewel in the age of the telegraph. The expel the barbarian half of the slogan died first, educationally. Satsuma exchanged fire with a British squadron and watched its capital burn under naval shellfire. Choshu closed the straits to foreign shipping and was bombarded open by an allied fleet. And both domains, being serious men, drew the serious conclusion: the barbarians could not be expelled with what Japan had. Therefore Japan must acquire what the barbarians had. Therefore the shogunate, which stood in the way, must go. The two rivals allied in secret, bought rifles through British merchants, drilled peasant mixed regiments in modern tactics. And when the shogun's armies moved against Choshu, the new model units of a single domain fought the whole tent government to a standstill, and every power in Japan updated its arithmetic at once. In November 1867, the last shogun, Yoshinobu, an intelligent man who could read a ledger of forces, returned his commission to the throne, ending the shogunate with a memorial. The radicals, wanting not resignation but revolution, seized the palace weeks later and proclaimed the restoration of imperial rule under the boy emperor Meiji. The brief civil war that followed. Boshin, the Year of the Dragon, broke the loyalist northeast in a handful of campaigns. At Eizu, the war's tragic set piece, the castle held under bombardment for a month. The women of the house fighting and dying with Naginata, Nakano Takeko falling at the head of her improvised corpse. A squad of teenage cadets, seeing smoke over the town and believing the castle fallen, cut their bellies on the hillside in a body. And the fire lets Eizu stand for all of it. The old world's virtues, courage, loyalty, and death before surrender, spent in full against rifled artillery and buying nothing but remembrance. By 1869, the last holdouts had surrendered on the northern island. The emperor had moved into the shogun's own castle, and Edo had a new name: Tokyo, the eastern capital. of a state that now set about doing the most astonishing thing in tonight's whole story, abolishing, with stroke after stroke of the modernizing brush, the very class that had made the revolution. It took 8 years of paper to end 700 years of the sword, and the fire counts the strokes, because their speed still astonishes. The men who now ruled in the young emperor's name, nearly all of them samurai of Satsuma and Choshu, most under 40, had concluded, with the unsentimental clarity of their class at its best, that Japan could survive the age of empires only as a modern nation-state, and that a modern state could not contain a hereditary armed caste. They proceeded accordingly against themselves. In 1869, the domain's registers were returned to the throne. In 1871, by decree, the domains themselves were abolished. 260 statelets, some older than the shogunate, dissolved into prefectures in a morning. The daimyo pensioned into peers. In 1872 came universal conscription. The army of the new Japan would be the farmers' sons the sword hunt had disarmed, drilled in trousers to French and Prussian manuals. The samurai's defining function, war, nationalized out of his hands. In 1876, the stipends, the hereditary rice that had fed the caste through the whole peace, were compulsorily commuted into modest government bonds, genteel poverty made official. And in the same year, the edict that touched the soul. The wearing of swords in public was prohibited to all but the new army and police. The top knots had already been falling. The emperor himself cut his in 1873, and the barbers of the cities did brisk business in the new cropped style. Photographs of the era show the transformation face by face. The same men, samurai in 1865. Armour, blades, the old world entire. And in 1877 ministers in frock coats, officers in braid, teachers in spectacles. There was no massacre of the samurai, no prescription, no guillotine, no tumbrils in the streets. The class was not destroyed but dissolved. Into the army and the police, the ministries and the schools, the banks, the newspapers, the new professions, the ex-samurai, carrying the caste's literacy and discipline into modernity, became its administrators as they had been the Tokugawas. The peace, it turned out, had been the rehearsal all along. But a world does not end without a funeral, and the funeral was Satsuma, 1877. The government's own great paladin, Saigo Takamori, the massive, magnetic Satsuma general who had led the Restoration's armies and negotiated Edo's bloodless surrender, the most beloved samurai of his generation, had broken with his colleagues over the pace of the dismantling and the treatment of the class that had made them, and withdrawn to Kagoshima to run academies for samurai youth. In January 1877, the young men rose, and Saigo, in the oldest samurai pattern of all, the lord who owns his followers' deeds, placed himself at their head. The Satsuma Rebellion was the last samurai war, and it was fought with perfect historical irony, largely between samurai. The rebel swordsmen and riflemen of the old fighting province against a conscript national army officered by their own former comrades, supplied by railway and steamship, coordinated by telegraph. It lasted 8 months and was never in doubt after the failed siege of Kumamoto Castle. The rebels' desperate night sword charges through the rain hurt the conscripts badly enough that the government raised a special sword-armed police battalion against them, the old world exacting its tuition to the last. But numbers, logistics, and artillery ground the rising down the length of Kyushu, until in September the last few hundred stood on the hill of Shiroyama above Kagoshima, surrounded by 30,000. The final assault came before dawn. Saigo, wounded in the hip in the descent, made his end in the old form. The accounts differ in detail, agree in meaning, with a companion striking off his head that it might not be taken. And by full morning, the samurai class's 7th century military history was over, on a green hill, in the rain, 40 minutes' walk from where the fire's listeners can stand today. The Meiji government, which had killed him, understood exactly what it had killed. Within 12 years, Saigo was pardoned, mourned, and raised in bronze. The famous statue in Ueno Park, the big man in a plain robe walking his dog. Not as a rebel, but as the last samurai. The state that abolished the class had discovered, before the smoke cleared, that it urgently needed the legend, and that discovery. What modern Japan and the modern world then built out of the vanished class is the final movement of tonight's story, but it will wait for the last rest, because the fire has earned it, and so have you. And now the fire banks itself for the last time before the summing, and the night returns, once more, to where it began, but changed, as the listener is changed, by everything between. It is the same mountain valley, the same winter, the same slow snow, but later now, much later, in the deepest trough of the night, and we are down in the valley itself, in the courtyard of the temple, whose bell has kept us company since the first hour. The bell house stands open on its posts, the great bronze bell hanging dark and patient, taller than a man, its surface worn smooth at the strike point by centuries of the swinging beam. Snow has drifted onto the beam's back and onto the bell's crown, and the bell lets it lie. An old monk crosses the courtyard on the hour. You hear him before you see him, the soft crush of his steps, unhurried in felt boots, and takes the beam's rope without ceremony, as he has 10,000 times, draws it back, and lets it go. The strike is not loud, it is total. A deep bronze bloom that fills the valley the way water fills a bowl, rolls out over the buried fields and the sleeping farmhouses, up the cedar slopes, over the pass where a warrior walked at the night's beginning. And then the long decay, the note thinning and thinning past the point where hearing ends and something else takes over, so that you cannot say, ever, exactly when it stopped. The snow absorbing the last of it, the valley holding the shape of the sound after the sound is gone. The monk bows slightly to the bell, or to the hour, and crushes back across the courtyard. The snow begins, patiently, to fill his steps. The Heike's opening. The fire has kept it for this moment. Says the bell of the Gion temple tolls the impermanence of all things. The proud do not endure. They are like a dream on a spring night. The mighty fall at last, as dust before the wind. Every hour of tonight's story has been that bell's one sentence, spoken over and over in different names. The perfumed court, the drowned child emperor, the demon king in his burning temple, the golden regent's line extinguished, the 2-century peace, the class itself dissolving into frock coats and bronze statues. Struck, blooming, thinning, gone, the valley holding the shape. And the bell means it. This is the part the West sometimes mishears, not as despair, but as instruction, because everything passes. This hour, this snow, this breath, is the whole estate. Attend to it. The warrior in the past knew it. The tea-master built a room for it. The monk crossing the courtyard is doing it now. Rest in the long decay of the note as far down as it will carry you. There is one more movement to the story. What the world made of the samurai after the samurai were gone, and it is a quiet one, fit for the hour, and then the summing, and then the last mile down into rest. The bell will keep the time. It has kept it, in this valley, for 600 years, and it has never once hurried the night. Edo held the shogun and the hostage lords, but the peace built more than one great city, and the fire gives a short hour to the two that balanced it, because the samurai world's economy and half its texture lived in cities the samurai did not rule. Osaka first, the merchant's capital, the kitchen of the realm. It had no great daimyo and few samurai worth the name. It had the river mouth, the warehouses, and the rice. For here the domains of the whole West shipped their tax rice to be sold. And here, in the counting houses along the canals, grew the machinery that quietly governed the age's real economy. The great merchant houses, some of whose names are still over Japan's banks and department stores today. The rice brokers whose dealings at the Dojima exchange became, by the early 18th century, something the world had scarcely seen. Trading in rice not yet harvested, in warehouse receipts passed hand to hand, in futures, one of the first organized futures markets on earth, run by townsmen, pricing the very stipends the samurai lived on. The city ran on the abacus and the account book. Its culture was the merchants. The puppet theatre in its glory. The great playwright Chikamatsu writing his double suicides for Osaka audiences. A plain, shrewd, generous civic character the whole country still recognizes in an Osaka accent. And the deep irony of the age lived on those canals. The samurai owned the rice and despised the men who priced it. The men who priced it owned, by slow degrees, the samurai's debts, and the official order and the actual order, face to face across a merchant's threshold, both kept their manners and both knew the score. And Kyoto, the old capital, where the powerless emperor still kept his court among the temples, and where the piece's other economy hummed, the luxury crafts, refined across 1,000 years and never interrupted. The looms of the Nishijin district weaving the silk brocades that dressed every rank that could afford rank, the dyers along the river, the makers of lacquer, of fans, of the tea ceremonies' every implement, of the dolls and the incense and the sweets, the potters and the sword-fitting makers and the gold leaf beaters. A whole city organized around the patient hand, supplying the aesthetic appetites of the entire realm and training the taste that judged them. Kyoto gave the age its refinement as Osaka gave it its money and Edo its power, and the three-cornered traffic between them. Power, money, and beauty, shuttling along the Tokaido in the endless processions, was the piece's true circulatory system. The samurai stood, officially, above all three cities. But the fire has made its point often enough tonight, and makes it once more, gently, the class that ruled the piece did not, in the end, own it. The piece belonged to the people who fed it, financed it, and made it beautiful. And when the samurai vanished, those people and their cities barely broke stride. The strangest chapter of the samurai story begins after their death as a class, because the samurai vanished and became universal in the same half-century, and the fire tells this last movement carefully, keeping its lamp of honesty lit to the end. Begin with the word the whole world now knows, Bushido, the way of the warrior. The modern world met it in 1900, in a book written in English, in America, by a Japanese Quaker, Nitobe Inazo's Bushido, the Soul of Japan, composed to explain his country's ethics to the West, presenting the samurai code. Rectitude, courage, benevolence, politeness, sincerity, honor, loyalty, as Japan's equivalent of chivalry. The book was elegant, sincere, hugely influential. An American president admired it. And, as the fire flagged in the night's first hour, it was less a description than a construction. The historical samurai had left many codes, house rules, and treatises, disagreeing across 7 centuries about nearly everything. The seamless, timeless ethic was assembled late, from selected threads, by men explaining an ideal. Some, like Nitobe, to dignify Japan abroad. Others, more darkly, at home. The young imperial state, needing a soul for its conscript army and its schoolbooks, nationalized the samurai ethic. Loyalty, once owed to one's lord, rewired to emperor and nation. Death before surrender, once a warrior house's private extremity, taught to every farm boy in uniform. And that state-built Bushido marched, in the 20th century, into wars and atrocities this fire will not follow tonight, and fell, in 1945, with the empire that built it. Since when Japanese scholarship itself has done the sifting, separating the Edo texts from the Meiji construction from the militarist appropriation, so that the honest sentence now reads, the samurai were real, their ideals were real and contested and human. The single eternal code is a modern artifact, and knowing that subtracts nothing from the 47 in the snow and adds the one thing legends always lack, which is truth. And then, the gentler afterlife. The world simply fell in love. The open Japan of the Meiji decades poured its art across the West. The Prince of Hokusai and Hiroshige rewired European painting. And when the new century brought film, the samurai found their immortal form. Kurosawa Akira. The fire names him as the tradition's greatest single heir. Took the vanished world and made it speak to everyone. 7 samurai, the hired defenders of a peasant village, remade in Hollywood as a Western within 6 years. The traffic of influence running both ways, for Kurosawa had learned from Ford's Westerns what he now taught back. Yojimbo becoming the Dollars films and the Man with No Name. The Hidden Fortress lending its bickering peasant pair perspective, and its princess and general plot to a young American filmmaker assembling a space fantasy. So that the samurai's armor silhouette, the masked black helmet of the Warring Age, stands scarcely disguised in the most famous villain of modern cinema, and the Jedi's very name and code descend from Jidageki, the period drama, and its warrior, Wei. The sword schools survived. The old transmissions, Yagyu and the rest, teach today in the dojo of every continent. Kendo, the way of the sword in bamboo and armor, is practiced by millions. The tea still steams in Rikyu's 4.5 mats from Kyoto to Sao Paulo. The 47's graves still smoke with incense. The heike is still chanted, and the great blades sleep in museum cases where children press close to the glass to find the misted temper line, the mountain range at the edge of the steel. The one thing about the samurai that every debunking leaves exactly as wondrous as the legend found it. The class is gone. Utterly, legally, a century and a half gone. No one alive holds the status. The world it made proved portable. The stillness, the craft, the terrible questions about loyalty and death, the beauty wrung from impermanence. Cargo, the fire would say, remembering another night's long road of camels and bells, and the caravan of it is still moving, oasis to oasis, mind to mind, at the old walking pace, and has just, this evening, by a fire that does not exist, made one more delivery. Before the themes, the fire takes its customary inventory. Not of what ended, but of what crossed over. The vanished world's permanent deposits in the world you will wake in tomorrow. Read slowly, like turning heirlooms in the hand. In the ground and on the skylines, the 12 original keeps, white above their towns, and the concrete resurrections beside them that the towns could not do without. Himeji's heron poise, the fan-sloped stone that still sheds earthquakes, Nikko's lantern avenues, the 47's graves at Sengakuji with their standing incense, the temple bell houses keeping the hours this meditation borrowed. In the hand, the blades in their museum cases and shrine treasuries, Haman still misted along the edge, and the craft alive. Licensed smiths still smelt tamahagain in the old clay furnace, fold the jewel steel, and paint the clay, their annual output limited by law and their apprenticeships as long as ever. The tea bowls still fired rough and dark in the kilns, Rikyu's taste founded, the schools of his descendants still teaching one meeting one time on every continent. The 17 syllables, written this morning in 100 languages, counted on fingers by school children who will never hear the word Edo. In the body, the ways. Kendo's bamboo thunder in 10,000 gyms. The old sword transmissions, Yagyu and the rest, handed scroll to scroll. Judo and Aikido and karate carrying the warrior pedagogy. Etiquette, gradings, the dojo bow to an empty room. Into the world's childhoods, the archery halls where the great asymmetric bow is still drawn as moving meditation, the target described by the masters as optional. In the calendar and the eye, the blossom viewing parties under the falling cherries. The whole nation still keeping, every April, the samurai's chosen emblem of beautiful impermanence as a public holiday of picnics. The gardens, raked this morning. The alcove with its single scroll and single flower, the ancestor of every minimal interior on earth. In the language of story, the heike still chanted and taught. Chushingura revived on schedule. Musashi's 5 rings on the business school shelves, the fire smiles and passes on. Kurosawa's frames inside half the films you have seen, knowingly or not, the black-masked silhouette in the space fantasy. The word samurai itself. Like shogun, like tycoon from Tycoon, the shogun's own diplomatic title of all survivals the drollest. Naturalized into English and 100 tongues as the very name for the masterly and the devoted. And in the questions, this is the true estate. What does loyalty owe when law and honour split? The 47's question, asked now in every ethics seminar and every whistleblower's midnight. Whether the ideal is corrupted or completed by the peace that polishes it. Whether a class can end itself with grace. Asked urgently by every entrenched order since. How to hold impermanence as instruction rather than grief. asked by everyone, eventually in some small hour like this one. The vanished world's furniture is scattered through ours, but its deepest export was never the sword or the bowl. It was a set of questions sharpened for 700 years and left, like the blades, beautifully maintained, edge intact, for whoever picks them up. Before the fire draws its themes, one comparison it has circled all night and now sets down plainly, because the West met the samurai and reached instantly for the one word it had, night, and the comparison is illuminating exactly where it holds and where it breaks. Where it holds deep, and the parallel is one of history's genuine strange rhymes. At nearly the same centuries, at opposite ends of Eurasia, two societies produced a mounted, armoured, land-holding warrior aristocracy bound to its lords by personal oaths of service and reward. The fief for the knight, the confirmed estate for the samurai. Both grew a code of honour, an ethic of loyalty and courage and shame. Both cultivated their women's spheres and their poets alongside their swords. Both built castles and fought over land. Both, crucially, arose when a central authority weakened and local strongmen filled the gap with private force. Historians use the same word, feudal, for both, and argue about it endlessly and rightly, but the family resemblance is real. If you set a 12th century Minamoto horse archer beside a 12th century Norman knight, they would have understood each other's lives to a startling degree. The horse, the bow or lance, the lord, the honour, the house, the dread of a bad death. But the fire, keeping its lamp lit, marks where the mirror cracks, because the differences are where the samurai become themselves. The European knight was folded, over time, into a Christendom with a single church that claimed to stand above all lords and to judge all violence. The samurai's world had no such overarching church, and his loyalty ran to house and lord without a Rome to appeal past them. The knight's ideal of chivalry was shaped by the church and by the cult of romantic love. The samurai's was shaped by Zen, by ancestor reverence, and by a Confucian ethic of obligation. A different music entirely. And above all, their endings could not have differed more, and the ending is the whole point of tonight. The European knight faded slowly, over centuries, into gentry and aristocracy and ceremony, his armour drifting into heraldry and his descendants into parliaments. No single day ended him. The samurai were ended on purpose, in 8 years, by their own members, and passed almost at once from a living class into a global legend, vanishing utterly where the knight merely dissolved. The West, reaching for night, caught the resemblance and missed the fate. And it is the fate that makes the samurai the samurai. Not that they were Japan's knights, but that they are the great warrior class that history let end cleanly and then could not stop dreaming about. The mirror is worth holding up. But the face in it, looked at long enough, is not a Western one wearing strange armour. It is its own face, and it is looking back at something the West never had to watch. The total, deliberate, dignified vanishing of a world. Draw the night together now, as the embers settle and the snow goes on falling. The deep lessons the vanished warrior world has been teaching beneath its stories. The first, the servants inherit. The samurai began as armed attendants of an aristocracy too refined to govern, and the refinement was the abdication. A class that will not do its own hard work is training its replacements. The pattern ran twice more within the story. The shogun's deputies eclipsing shoguns, the domain clerks of Satsuma and Choshu ending the shogunate itself. And it is not a Japanese pattern, but a human one, and every institution that outsources its essentials is running the experiment again. The second, the ideal is written by the piece. The warrior code the world admires was perfected by men who never fought. The war stories polished in the tea-room centuries. The loyalty absolute only after loyalty had ceased to be tested. The sword becoming a soul precisely as it ceased to be a tool. This is not hypocrisy. It is how ideals are actually made. Reality first, then distance, then meaning. And it counsels a gentle skepticism toward every golden age, including one's own grandfathers, and a gentle mercy too. The polishing is also a kind of love. The third, a class can end without a catastrophe. The samurai were not massacred, expropriated by mobs, or broken on a wheel of revolution. They were legislated away in 8 years, largely by their own members, because enough of them concluded that the nation mattered more than the caste. And then they walked into the ministries and the schools and built what came next. History offers few gentler endings to entrenched privilege, and few are still engineered by the privileged themselves. The fire holds it up, not as a common possibility, but as a proven one, which is worth something on any night. The fourth, stillness is a martial art. The deepest samurai invention was not a weapon, but a discipline of attention. The unstopping mind of the sword masters, the one meeting one time of the tea room, the garden that is a world in 12 paces. A warrior caste, of all people, discovered that the decisive ground is internal and spent centuries mapping it and left the maps. They are still legible. They require no swords, and of everything in tonight's story, they are the most immediately useful to a person lying quietly in the dark. And the fifth, the bell's own, impermanence is not the sad part. Everything in this story ended. The court, the clans, the castle's purpose, the class itself, and the ending is not the tragedy but the medium. The cherry blossom the samurai took as their emblem was chosen because it falls at its height, and the falling is the beauty. A world that vanished entire within one lifetime and left behind gardens, bowls, poems, films, and a way of paying attention. That is not a defeat by time. That is what winning against time actually looks like. Nothing else has ever looked different. So let the whole of it pass once more, gathered and slow, like the last procession of the year crossing a snowy province. The entire story, once through, before the fire lets it go. It begins 1,000 years ago, in a city of silk and moonlight, where an aristocracy judges souls by handwriting, weeps at falling blossoms, writes the world's first novel, and hires its violence out to rustics it will not deign to notice. And out in the despised provinces, the hired violence organizes. Horsemen with great bows, imperial-blooded chieftains, households banking glory like rice, until the perfumed factions call the warriors into the capital to settle a quarrel, and the warriors look around and understand. The Taira rise first and rise too high. The Minamoto answer? And 5 years of war end in a sea strait where the tide turns at noon and a grandmother steps into the waves with a 6-year-old emperor in her arms and the sacred sword at her waist. The crabs of those waters wear scowling faces still, glaring up through the shallows at the world that drowned them. The victor builds his tent government far from the silk, invents the shogun's Japan, emperor as jewel, warrior as hand, and destroys his own incomparable brother, whom the nation refuses forever to let die. The Mongols come twice, with thunder bombs and the largest fleet on earth. A stone wall, night-boarding swordsmen, and 2 typhoons named the winds of the gods send them away. And the unpayable rewards of that victory crack the regime that won it. Zen arrives on the same tide and teaches the killers stillness. The second shogunate gilds pavilions while the provinces slip its hands, and in 1467 the floor gives way. A century and a half of the low overthrowing the high, guns from a wrecked Portuguese junk, castles on every hill, until the 3 men of the proverb take the stage in sequence. The demon king who breaks the old world with guns and free markets and terror, burns the holy mountain, and dies in a midnight temple with his unification a year from finished. The sandal bearer who conquers all Japan, freezes the classes with the ladder he climbed, kills his own tea master, and wastes a generation on Korea and the one who waited. Hostage, survivor, master of time, who wins the fog morning at Sekigahara on a traitor's hillside hesitation and builds the machine. Hostage processions, 1 castle to a domain, a fan-shaped island of Dutchmen, and a peace of 250 years. Inside the sealed vessel, the strangest act. The warriors become clerks, the sword becomes a soul, fencing becomes philosophy, the tea room becomes an empire of 4.5 mats. Genzo balances ledgers he cannot make balance while the merchants he bows over grow rich. The 47 answer, the piece is one great question in blood and snow and are condemned and honoured in the same verdict. The women hold the houses as they always had. The ronin drift like their name. Then 4 black ships stand into Edo Bay, trailing coal smoke, and the 2.5-century held breath releases in 15 years. The exiled Southwest returns from the edges of the Sekigahara map, learns from British shellfire that the barbarians cannot be expelled and must therefore be equalled, and ends the shogunate with rifles and a boy emperor. Eizu's women die with naginata against artillery, and the revolution's own samurai then abolish themselves. Domains, stipends, top-knots, and at last the swords, in 8 years of paper, until the beloved Saigo leads the old world's funeral procession up a green hill above Kagoshima and dies in the rain, and the state that killed him casts him in bronze walking his dog because it has discovered, before the smoke cleared, that it cannot live without the legend. And the legend goes out into the whole world, misassembled into a timeless code, marched into a terrible century, sifted back toward truth by Japan's own scholars, and, gentler, into the films and the dojos and the tea schools and the museum cases where children look for the mist in the steel, so that a class which vanished utterly within a single lifetime is tonight, on the far side of the planet, in the small hours, by a fire that does not exist, still teaching a stranger 7 lifetimes and half a planet away how to pay attention to snow, which is to say, how to be briefly, completely, and gratefully alive in a world where nothing stays. And now the story is told, and there is nothing left to guard, and no one left to serve. The wars are 7 lifetimes finished. The castles keep only ticket gates and cherry trees. The last stipend was commuted before your great-great-grandparents met. And the snow, which was falling when the warrior crossed the pass at the night's first hour, is falling still on the whole vanished world at once, on the pass, on the temple, on the drowned strait and the fog-morning valley, on the green hill above Kagoshima, on the graves where the incense never quite goes out. Let it fall. Let it cover everything now, evenly, without hurry, the way it always intended to. And let yourself be covered too. Not buried, covered, the way the garden stones are covered, each thing keeping its shape under a soft white weight that asks nothing. You may let your eyes rest now. Close them if they wish to close. The snow does the same work either way, behind the lids. The slow grey-white drift, the flakes appearing out of a soft nowhere and descending without wind, each one landing with a weight too small to feel and, together, over the hours, quieting a whole country. Let your body grow heavy the way the pine boughs grow heavy. Gradually, evenly, without resistance, bending under the gathered white until, at some point no one witnesses, a bough lets its whole load slide off at once with a hush, and is light again and lifts. Let your shoulders make that small release now. The day's gathered weight sliding away in one soft collapse, absorbed instantly by the dark, gone. Let your hands soften and open on the covers, palms down, like the temple courtyard's flat stones receiving the snow. Each flake a small, cold instant of arrival, then belonging. And let your breath find the bell's own measure, the oldest rhythm in tonight's whole world. The long, slow in-breath, drawing back the beam, the release. And then the endless decaying out-breath, the bronze bloom thinning and thinning past the edge of hearing so that you cannot say. Do not try to say. Exactly where the breath ends and the stillness begins. In, like the beam drawn back. Out, like the note going down the valley into the snow. Again. There is no one keeping count. The monk has gone in. The hour is kept by the falling itself. And the images of the night may drift down with the flakes now, unarmoured, weightless, asking nothing. You need not hold a single one. The poem tied to a plum branch in a court that judged souls by handwriting. The little emperor's question, and the answer about the capital beneath the waves. The deer picking their way down the cliff at Ichinotani, and the horses following. The stone wall standing off an empire, and the small boats going out in the dark. 15 stones in raked gravel, one always hidden. The clay painted thin along the edge, and the blade curving itself in the water, and the misted line where the two steels meet. the lantern procession of a lord who will never fight, crossing a province in perfect order to be a hostage in silk. Genzo's brush and Genzo's bow to his own swords. The whisk in the dark bowl, the crawling door, one meeting, one time. Snow on 47 graves and incense standing straight up in the cold. The black ship's coal smoke on a summer sky. A topknot on a barber's floor. The big man in bronze, walking his dog forever in a Tokyo park. Let each one fall and land and whiten and lose its edges and join the general shining. The way the whole vanished world has joined it. Not lost, covered, kept. And if sleep is rising in you now, let it rise. It comes tonight the way snow quiet comes to a valley, not as an event but as a completion. The last sounds spacing themselves wider. The bell, a bow's hush. The bell, fainter, until the spaces join, and the quiet is simply what there is. The people of tonight's story had a word for the feel of this hour, the beauty of things passing, and they built their whole world's meaning on trusting it. The blossom falls at its height. The note is most beautiful in its decay. The deepest attention is paid at the threshold of letting go. You are at that threshold now, and everything on the other side of it is soft. The vanished world made one more thing before it went, and it made it for exactly this hour. A way of lying, still inside impermanence, as inside a warm room, listening to the snow, owing nothing, guarding nothing, needing nothing but the next slow, bell-measured breath. And then, not even that. One last thought, offered as softly as the last flake landing. The vanished world spent 7 centuries learning a single lesson, and left it for you, tonight, wrapped in snow. That everything you are holding, this breath, this warmth, this small lit room in the enormous dark, is already, at this very moment, falling, and that the falling is not the thief of its worth, but the whole of it. The warrior in the past was beautiful because the snow was covering his tracks even as he made them. The bowl of tea mattered because the gathering would never come again. The blossom was chosen because it lets go at its brightest. You do not have to hold any of it. You never could. You only have to be here for it, once, completely. Which is all the samurai ever managed either, under all that armour. And it was enough for them. The whole of their strange, armoured, disciplined, doomed, magnificent enterprise came down to that, in the end. And it is enough tonight, and it asks nothing of you now but to let the last of it fall, and settle, and shine. So rest now, traveller. The pass is white and trackless, the castle brazier is banked, the garden lanterns are out, and the pond has closed its one bright eye. The bell has a keeper, the graves have their incense, the story has its singers, and none of it, needs you until morning. The snow is doing the watching tonight, as it has done over that valley for 1,000 years, falling straight and slow and certain on everything at once, the mighty and the small together, dust before no wind at all. The east will take care of the dawn. It always has. Over the pass and the cedar slopes, over the sea strait where the tide still turns at noon, over the fog-morning valley and the burned castle and the green hill above Kagoshima and the bronze man and his dog in the Tokyo park. It will come up grey, then pearl, then gold on the unbroken white, and the valley will lie new-made and printless, the way the world lies every morning for those who have slept. You have nothing left to do but breathe with the bell and grow heavy as the boughs and let the last long note carry you down under the warm white weight of the night. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.